Hey, welcome back, Night Owl. Wherever you are right now, tucked under a blanket, lying on your side, staring at the ceiling, wondering why your brain refuses to slow down. I am genuinely glad you found your way here tonight. Make yourself comfortable. Let the day go. Whatever happened out there, it can wait until morning. Tonight we're going somewhere extraordinary together. Imagine you're standing in the middle of the largest, loudest, most chaotic city in all of Western Europe. It is the year 1558, and something enormous, something that will change history forever, is already quietly unfolding in the shadows before sunrise even touches the rooftops. The city smells of wood smoke, river mud, horse dung, and baking bread all at once, all fighting for your attention, all completely real. More than 120,000 human beings are crammed into a space you could walk across in under an hour, and every single one of them, the merchant, the beggar, the baker, the queen, is about to wake up on the most remarkable day this city has seen in a generation. So before we step into those streets together, do me a small favor. If the stories I bring you genuinely move you, genuinely pull you in, genuinely make you feel something, take 2 seconds and hit that subscribe button or leave a little comment down below telling me where you are in the world right now, what time it is, and what brought you here tonight. Those little gestures mean more to me than you know. And one last thing before we begin. Dim the lights if you can. Put on the softest background sound you have. Let your breathing slow just a little, because tonight's journey deserves your full unhurried attention. Let us go. The first thing you need to understand about Tudor London in the year 1558 is this: it was not one city, it was two, maybe even three, depending on which corner you were standing in and how full your stomach was. On the surface, and only on the surface, London in 1558 looked magnificent. Visitors from across Europe described it with a kind of breathless wonder, the way people today describe walking into a place and suddenly understanding why everyone talks about it. The Flemish writer Emmanuel van Meteren, who lived in London during this period, called it a city of infinite riches and variety of all things. The playwright John Lilly, writing just a few years after our story begins, declared that London excelleth all the cities in the world, calling it the storehouse and marketplace of all of Europe. And honestly, looking at it from a distance from the south bank of the Thames on a clear autumn morning, they were not wrong. The skyline was extraordinary. The old St. Paul's Cathedral rose over everything, its spire stretching nearly 500 feet into the sky, taller than almost anything in Europe at the time. The stone walls of the Tower of London glowed pale in the morning light. Church steeples punctured the air in every direction, more than 100 of them. Some historians say scattered across the city like exclamation points, each one marking a neighbourhood, a community, a small world of its own. The River Thames, wider and shallower than it is today, glittered with the constant movement of boats, not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. Historians estimate that by the mid-16th century, approximately 2,000 small ferry vessels called wherries were operating on the Thames on any given day, transporting goods and passengers the way taxicabs move through a modern city. Can you picture that? 2,000 boats all at once on a river in the middle of a city. The noise alone must have been something else, and woven through all of it the church bells. Oh, the church bells. In Tudor London, church bells were not background noise, they were the city's nervous system. They told you when to wake up, when to pray, when the market opened, when a man had been hanged at Tyburn, when a queen had died. They ran the whole show. Historian Liza Picard, who spent years reconstructing the sensory world of Elizabethan London, described the constant ringing as so deeply embedded in daily life that Londoners barely consciously heard it anymore, the same way you stop noticing the hum of your refrigerator after a while. But here is the thing about that beautiful bell-ringing, boat-filled, cathedral-piercing skyline. The moment you actually walked into those streets, the moment you descended from that distant, poetic viewpoint and stepped into the actual physical reality of London in 1558, everything changed. The golden facade cracked almost immediately. The streets were narrow, extraordinarily narrow. Upper stories of buildings jutted out over lower stories, a style called jettying, so far that neighbours on opposite sides of a lane could lean out their windows and nearly shake hands. In some parts of the city, the buildings overhead blocked out the sky entirely, turning the streets below into permanent tunnels, of shadow even on the brightest summer day. There was no paved road in the modern sense of the word. There were no drains. There were no sewers. Everything, and I do mean everything, went into the street. Butchers in one district called the Shambles slaughtered animals directly in the road and let the blood and entrails flow wherever. The ground took them. Residents of every neighbourhood were legally required by city ordinance to dump their household waste not in any designated area but simply outside their own front door to be collected theoretically by a raker who came through with a cart. Theoretically. The smell, even by the cautious and diplomatic standards of contemporary observers, was something that modern words struggle to fully honour. Andrew Board, a physician writing in the early Tudor period, advised gentlemen travelling to London to avoid the narrower lanes entirely, particularly in summer, on account of the corruption of the air. He was not being dramatic, he was being practical. In a city without antibiotics, without germ theory, without any real understanding of how disease spread, a bad smell was not just unpleasant, it was genuinely considered a health threat. The miasma theory, the belief that bad air itself caused illness, was the dominant medical understanding of the time, and in Tudor London bad air was simply everywhere. And yet people kept coming. This is the part that genuinely fascinates me about London in 1558. Despite the filth, despite the danger, despite the smell, the disease, the poverty, the overcrowding, London in this year had approximately 120,000 residents, up from about 50,000 just 60 years earlier. People were flooding in from the countryside, from Wales, from Scotland, from the Low Countries, from the Protestant communities of France, fleeing religious persecution. By the end of the 16th century, that number would nearly double again to almost 200,000. What were they all chasing? The same thing people have always chased when they move to a great city. A chance. Just a chance. Because for all its misery, London in 1558 was also undeniably electrifyingly alive. Cheapside, the great east-west artery running through the heart of the city, was lined with shops selling everything imaginable. Not just bread and candles and rope, gold, silk from the Ottoman Empire, spices from the East Indies that had passed through a dozen hands and travelled 10,000 miles before landing in a tiny wooden stall in the middle of London. The goldsmiths of Cheapside were so numerous and so prosperous that their row of shops became one of the wonders of the city, a glittering stretch of wealth that foreign visitors mentioned in their letters home almost every time. We know this because in 1912, workmen digging beneath Cheapside discovered something extraordinary. A hoard of Tudor-era jewellery and gemstones buried beneath the street. Hundreds of pieces, emeralds and rubies, and intricately worked gold, quietly sitting in the earth for 3 centuries. The Cheapside hoard, as it is now known, is on display today at the Museum of London, and it is jaw-dropping. It tells you without a single word just how much wealth was moving through that street. But walk half a mile in any direction from Cheapside, just half a mile, and the picture shifted completely. In the parishes just beyond the city walls, in the narrow lanes east of the Tower, in the crowded tenements of Southwark across the river, roughly 1/3 of London's population was living in what we would today recognise immediately as desperate poverty. 1/3. That is not a footnote. That is not a rounding error. That is 40,000 human beings in a single city on the edge of survival in the year 1558. And here is where the history of Tudor London becomes not just interesting, but genuinely moving. Because those 40,000 people did not disappear. They did not vanish into statistics. They woke up every morning in this same city under this same ringing sky, breathing this same complicated air, and they figured out how to keep going. They hawked goods from baskets. They carried water for a penny. They repaired shoes and mended sails and unloaded cargo from the Thames in all weathers. They built their lives out of whatever the city left them. The historian Ian Mortimer, in his remarkable reconstruction of life in Tudor England, points out something that tends to get lost in the grand narrative. Of palaces and queens and explorers, the enormous, relentless, largely uncelebrated labour of ordinary people was the actual engine that made Tudor London function. The ships full of imported cloth that made the merchants of Cheapside rich were unloaded by men who earned a few pence a day and never saw the inside of one of those golden shops. The city ran on them. It just rarely noticed them. Which brings us in the most natural way possible to the morning of November the 17th, 1558. An ordinary Tuesday to begin with. Just another grey London morning, the Thames breathing mist onto the rooftops, the church bells doing their reliable work, the fishmongers of Billingsgate setting up their stalls in the dark, the apprentices rubbing sleep from their eyes and opening the shutters of their masters' shops. But beneath all of that ordinary Tuesday rhythm, something had already changed. Something enormous. Because in the hours before dawn, in a palace not far from this city, a 42-year-old queen had drawn her last breath. And all of London, all of that chaotic, beautiful, filthy, magnificent 120,000-person organism was about to discover that it had a new ruler. A young woman, 25 years old, red-haired, brilliant, sitting under an oak tree in the countryside reading a book, completely unaware that riders were already racing toward her with news that would change everything. And tonight we are going to walk through the London she inherited. We are going to see it the way it actually was, not the way the paintings show it. Not the way the history books tidy it up, but the way it smelled and sounded and felt on your skin. We're going to meet the people who lived there, the ones history remembers and the ones it forgot. Stay with me, because the city is just waking up, and trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next. There is a question I keep turning over in my mind whenever I study this period. Not the grand political questions, not who was fighting whom, not which treaty got signed, or which head rolled at the tower. Those matter, of course. But the question that actually keeps me up at night, the one that I think gets closest to the real heart of Tudor London, is this. What did it feel like to know exactly where you stood, not to wonder, not to aspire, not to climb, or hope, or question? To simply know from the moment you were born, from the clothes on your back and the food on your table, and the words that came out of your mouth, exactly what you were, exactly what you were allowed to be, and exactly where the ceiling sat above your head. Because that is the world Tudor London was built on, and it is a world almost impossible for a modern American to fully inhabit in the imagination. We grow up on the idea that if you work hard enough you can become anything. It is practically stitched into the national fabric. But in 1558 London, that idea would not just have been considered naive, it would have been considered dangerous, maybe even a little bit sinful. Let me explain. Tudor society rested on something called the Great Chain of Being. It sounds almost poetic when you say it out loud, and in a way it was, but it was also the most ruthlessly practical social control mechanism the period had to offer. The Great Chain of Being was a theological concept rooted in medieval Christian thought that held that all of creation existed in a fixed, God-ordained hierarchy. At the very top sat God, below him the angels, below them the king and queen, then the nobility, then the gentry, then the merchants and craftsmen, then the labourers, then the beggars, then the animals, and so on all the way down to the simplest grain of sand. Every single living thing had its appointed place. And the whole point, the whole theological weight of the idea was that to step outside your appointed place was not merely socially awkward, it was an offence against the natural order of the universe, against God himself. Now, think about what that means for a carpenter's son who gets rich in the wool trade. Think about what it means for a woman born into poverty who is smarter, sharper, more capable than every man in the room. Think about what it means for the 40,000 Londoners I mentioned earlier, the 1/3 of the city's population living on the edge of survival, who are told by the church, by the law, by everyone in authority above them, that their poverty is not an accident of history or economics or bad luck. It is the will of God. You can feel the full weight of that, can't you? Sit with it for a moment. The man who described Tudor society most carefully, most systematically, was a clergyman and writer named William Harrison. In his book, published in 1577, called Description of England, he laid out the social order with the calm precision of someone describing the weather. We in England divide our people commonly into 4 sorts: gentlemen, citizens, or burgesses, yeomen and artificers or labourers. 4 sorts. That is the whole world as Harrison saw it. At the top, the gentlemen, which included not just the nobility with their ancient titles and their acres of countryside, but also the gentry, a wider class of landowners, who had what Harrison called coat armour, meaning a family crest, meaning the kind of lineage that gave your name a shape in the world. By the 1550s, historians estimate there were roughly 4,500 such gentry families in all of England. Together they owned the majority of the land. Their average annual income was somewhere between £200 and £500 a year. To put that in some kind of human terms, a skilled craftsman in Tudor London doing well might earn £4 to £6 a year. The gap between those two numbers is not just financial, it is almost cosmological. Below the gentry came the merchants and citizens, the burgesses in Harrison's language. These were the men of the city, the successful traders and craftsmen, the goldsmith of Cheapside and the cloth merchant of the Guildhall. They lived in real houses with real furniture. Some of them were by any honest measure wealthy, and this is where Tudor society started to get genuinely interesting, because these men existed in a peculiar kind of middle, rich enough to cause anxiety among the aristocracy above them, not poor enough to be safely ignored. Then came the yeoman farmers who owned their own land or leased it under favourable terms, hard-working, literate, in many cases comfortable by the standards of their world. Harrison was fond of yeomen. He wrote that they were the backbone of England, which sounds like the kind of thing people always say about whichever class they want to flatter. And finally, at the bottom of Harrison's scheme, which is to say at the bottom of everything, came the labourers and artificers, the ones Harrison described with a phrase that still stings. A little even across 4.5 centuries, these were the people who had no voice nor authority in our commonwealth. No voice, no authority, just hands, just labour, just the daily business of surviving. Now here is where the story of Tudor London's social division gets genuinely strange, because the hierarchy was not just an abstract idea. It was not just a theological concept that lived in sermons and treatises. It was written into law, literally stitched into the fabric of what you were allowed to wear. The Tudors had something called sumptuary laws regulations that dictated in extraordinary detail exactly what each level of society could and could not put on their bodies. And I'm not talking about vague guidance. I'm talking about specifics so precise they are almost hard to believe today. Only members of the royal family could wear the colour purple. Only knights and lords or anyone earning more than £200 a year could wear red or blue velvet or coats trimmed with lynx fur or clothing embroidered with gold thread. Anyone earning less than £100 a year was forbidden from wearing taffeta, satin or damask, even if they could afford it. Even if the silk merchant around the corner had a bolt of damask in exactly their size sitting right there ready to go. The law said no. The law said you are not that sort of person. And this matters not just as a historical curiosity, but as a window into how Tudor London actually worked day to day. Because in a city of 120,000 people, in a place where strangers passed each other on Cheapside 100 times a day, and no one knew anyone's name, your clothing was your identity document. It was your social passport. It told everyone you passed exactly who you were before you opened your mouth, which means the law was not merely about fabric, it was about visibility. It was about making sure that the social order was legible at a glance. No ambiguity, no blurring. The merchant who had made a fortune in the wool trade had to remain visually, publicly, unmistakably below the knight who had inherited his position from a grandfather, even if in purely financial terms the merchant was richer. Honestly, if I had been a successful Tudor merchant, that would have driven me absolutely mad, and apparently it drove some of them mad too. Historians note that the sumptuary laws were in practice constantly violated. Rich merchants bought silk. Prosperous craftsmen wore colours above their station. The laws were updated again and again throughout the Tudor period by Henry VIII, then by Mary I, then by Elizabeth I, precisely because they kept failing to hold the line. The social fabric, to use the pun the Tudors would never have intended, kept fraying. But I want to step away from the merchant class for a moment, because the real human weight of this divided city, the part that genuinely moves me when I sit with it, is not the frustration of the rich man who cannot wear purple. It is the reality of the person who cannot eat. In the 1550s, as London grew and wages failed to keep pace with rising prices, the cost of basic goods in England roughly doubled between 1500 and 1580, a sustained inflation that economic historians trace to the influx of silver from the Americas flowing through Europe. The pressure on the poorest Londoners became almost incomprehensible. When the monasteries were dissolved by Henry VIII in the 1530s and 40s, something that rarely makes the headlines of that particular historical story also disappeared: the informal welfare system that had kept the very poorest alive for centuries. Monasteries had fed the hungry at their gates. Monks had run the hospitals. The church had been, however imperfectly, a safety net. That safety net was gone now. In its place, the Tudor government tried something new. Something that reveals, I think, more about Tudor attitudes toward poverty than almost any other single piece of evidence. They passed laws, lots of laws. The Act of 1536, signed when the wounds from the monastery closures were still fresh, stated that any person found begging outside their home parish without permission would be publicly whipped through the streets until their back bled, then returned to their place of birth. A second offence, part of the gristle of the right ear cut off. A third offence, execution. Let that sequence settle for a moment. Whipping, mutilation, death, for being poor in the wrong place. And here is the detail that I find most quietly devastating about this law. It was not aimed at criminals. It was not aimed at violent people or thieves or anyone who had hurt anyone. It was aimed at the unemployed, at the people who had left their home village looking for work, driven out by the enclosure of common land, by the disappearance of monastery employment, by the simple arithmetic of too many people and not enough jobs, and ended up on the streets of London with nothing. The law called them vagabonds. The word sounds almost romantic now, doesn't it? Like something out of a folk song. But in 1558, London being called a vagabond was one of the most dangerous designations a person could receive. There was, to be fair, a distinction in the law between what they called the impotent poor, the genuinely sick, the elderly, the disabled, the orphaned children, and the sturdy beggar, the able-bodied person, who in the government's view was simply choosing idleness over honest work. The impotent poor were to be cared for by their parish. The sturdy beggar was to be brought to heel. The problem, of course, the problem that every compassionate observer of the period noticed, but that the law stubbornly refused to acknowledge, was that most of the people on London's streets were not choosing to be there. A soldier who had come back from fighting in France with a wound that kept him from labouring. A woman widowed by the sweating sickness with 3 small children and no parish to return to. A farm labourer whose village common had been fenced off by a lord converting to sheep farming because wool was more profitable than people. These were not lazy men and women making a lifestyle choice. These were human beings inside a system that had broken down around them, and yet the law looked at them and saw moral failure, idleness, a problem to be punished into submission. By the time our story reaches November of 1558, by the time the new queen is about to inherit this city, Parliament had actually gone one step further than whipping and mutilation. In 1547, in a moment of legislative creativity that still feels almost surreal when you read it, Parliament had passed an act stating that homeless vagabonds could be enslaved. Enslaved. Legally owned by anyone who reported them to the authorities for a period of 2 years. If the enslaved person ran away, the period was extended to life. They could be fed on bread and water. They could be worked in any manner their master chose. This law was so extreme, so obviously unenforceable, so nakedly at odds with the practical realities of London life, that it was repealed just 3 years later in 1550, before it could cause the full chaos it threatened. But the fact that it was written, that it was passed, that it had the force of law even briefly over the bodies of the poorest people in England, that tells you something essential about the moral imagination of the world into which Elizabeth I was about to step. Now, I said earlier that I would ask you a question. Here it is. When you think about the poorest 40,000 people in Tudor London, the ones sleeping rough near the Thames, the ones whose backs had been marked by the legal whip, the ones who had lost an ear for the crime of looking for work, what is your instinct? Do you feel something like pity, anger? Or, and this is the harder, more honest question, do you feel somewhere underneath all that, a small flicker of familiarity, because the argument the Tudor government made about poverty, that it was fundamentally a moral failure, that the poor were poor because of some deficiency in character or will, is not an argument that died in the 16th century. It has a remarkably long life. It shows up in different clothes in different eras, but the basic bones of it, the idea that your position in life is primarily a reflection of your personal virtue, is one of the oldest and most persistent stories human societies tell about themselves. Tudor London just told it with a brutal directness that later centuries learned to dress up more elegantly. And one of the things that genuinely moves me about studying this period is watching ordinary people push back against that story quietly, persistently, in ways the official record barely noticed. The parish that quietly stretched the definition of impotent poor to cover a few more people than the law technically allowed. The craftsman who slipped a loaf of bread through a tenement door without making a show of it. The woman who hid her neighbour's child from the parish constable. The small, stubborn human acts of care that happened in the gaps of a system designed not to care. London in 1558 was hard. It was genuinely hard in ways that are difficult to hold in the imagination without looking away. But it was full of people, and people even in the most constricted circumstances, even under the most crushing weight of hierarchy and law and theological destiny, have a remarkable habit of looking out for each other when the official world is not watching. That is not a sentimental observation. It is, I think, one of the most important historical facts about this city. There is one more layer to this story of the two Londons that I want to leave you with before we move on, because so far I have drawn the divide mostly along economic lines, rich and poor, noble and labourer. But there was another division running through this city in 1558-1 that sat underneath all the others and gave them their particular shape, and that division had to do with geography. The City of London, the ancient walled core, the square mile around Cheapside, and the Guildhall and the Tower, was governed by the Lord Mayor and his aldermen, a tight oligarchy of wealthy merchants and tradesmen who took the rules of their world very seriously. Guild regulations, market hours, price controls. the elaborate hierarchy of apprentice, journeyman and master that governed every trade. Everything had its place, everything had its order, but step across London Bridge, just cross the river a short walk and you entered Southwark. And Southwark operated by completely different rules. Technically outside the Lord Mayor's jurisdiction, Southwark was the place where London put the things it wanted to have but did not want to officially acknowledge. The things that did not fit within the city's careful ordering of the world. We will spend a great deal of time in Southwark later in our story, because what happened on that south bank of the Thames is, I think, one of the most fascinating and most misunderstood chapters in the history of this city. But for now, let me just say this. The two Londons were not only rich and poor, noble and labourer silk and wool, they were also order and chaos, rule and exception, the world as it was supposed to be, and the world as it actually was. And as in most cities, in most times, in most human lives, the second one was considerably more interesting. Stay close, because we're about to cross the water together, not to Southwark yet, but to the one crossing that connected both sides of this city that served as its backbone and its landmark and its stranger street. London Bridge is waiting. And what was happening on that bridge in 1558, what was living there, what was displayed there, what was being sold and transacted and quietly observed from its crowded, overcrowded wooden shops, is something that will change in a small but permanent way how you think about what a city is for. Picture yourself stepping onto a street, a busy one, loud, crowded with merchants, apprentices, housewives with baskets a dog or two, weaving between ankles the smell of smoke and river water, and something you cannot quite identify, but suspect you would rather not. Shopkeepers calling from open doorways, a cart grinding past wheels scraping stone, children running, someone arguing loudly in a language you half recognise. Now picture that same street with the river rushing 30 feet below your shoes. That was London Bridge in 1558. And the people who lived and worked on it, most of them had stopped noticing the water entirely. Which, when you think about it, is either a remarkable feat of human adaptation, or a testament to how quickly the extraordinary becomes ordinary when you see it every single day. The bridge that connected the City of London to Southwark in 1558 was already 350 years old. It had been built in stone between 1176 and 1209, a project so ambitious, so technically daunting, that medieval Londoners credited its completion partly to divine intervention. A child saint named Peter of Colechurch, according to popular memory, helped raise the funds through miraculous means. Whether that is history or legend is a question historians still politely argue about. What is not in dispute is the engineering itself. The bridge stretched nearly 930 feet across the Thames, supported by 19 stone piers set on massive timber foundations called starlings, wide wooden platforms packed with rubble and stone anchored deep in the riverbed. Each starling jutted out into the current to protect its pier, but collectively they did something the builders had not entirely anticipated. They turned the Thames into something resembling a waterfall. By restricting the river's flow by up to 70 or 80%, the 19 starlings created a ferocious difference in water level on either side of the bridge, sometimes as much as 6 feet between the upstream and downstream sides. The result was a churning, roaring rush of white water that funneled through the narrow archways with terrifying force, particularly at low tide. The Thames watermen, the professional boatmen who worked the river, developed a saying for this stretch of water that has survived 4.5 centuries because it is simply too good to lose. London Bridge is for wise men to pass over and for fools to pass under, and it was not entirely a joke. Attempting to steer a boat through those archways, a feat the Londoners called shooting the bridge, was genuinely life-threatening. Passengers travelling by water would routinely disembark from their wherries at the docks, just upstream, walk across the bridge on foot and rejoin their vessel on the other side. The watermen themselves had to thread those corridors of rushing water with a skill that bordered on art. Not all of them made it. Ships regularly struck the starlings. Boats capsized. People drowned. There is a recorded account preserved in the chronicles of a barge belonging to the Duke of Norfolk that struck a starling on a November afternoon and sank. The Duke himself escaped by leaping onto the piles and being hauled up by ropes thrown from the bridge above. His companions were less fortunate. I keep coming back to that image, a duke clinging to a medieval bridge support in the middle of the Thames being pulled to safety while the river swallows the people around him. History in moments like that stops being abstract and becomes devastatingly human. But step onto the bridge from the city end and all that violent roiling water below was invisible. What you saw instead was a street. Paul Hentzner, a German lawyer who visited London in 1598, close enough to our year to paint a reliable picture, wrote about crossing the bridge with an astonishment that practically leaps off the page even now. The whole, he wrote, is covered on each side with houses so disposed as to have the appearance of a continued street, not at all of a bridge. Not at all of a bridge. Think about what it takes for a structure to so completely disguise its own nature, that a well-travelled, observant foreign visitor has to explicitly remind himself that he is not walking down an ordinary London lane. By the time Hentzner crossed it, there were somewhere between 80 and 90 separate buildings on the bridge. 4 stories tall, in many cases timber-framed, jutting out over the water, in that same jettied style you found throughout the city, their upper floors nearly touching the buildings on the opposite side of the roadway, narrowing the already tight passage between them to something barely wide enough for 2 carts to squeeze past each other. Some had what historians drawing from old property records describe as walking leads, flat-leaded paths behind roof balustrades where residents could take an evening stroll and look up and down the river in both directions. Can you imagine that living on a bridge? Taking your evening walk on your roof 30 feet above the Thames, watching the evening light change on the water. That is not a nightmare. That is actually quite beautiful. The rents from these building shops on the ground floor residences above helped fund the maintenance of the bridge itself, which means that in a very real sense the merchants of London Bridge were subsidising the infrastructure they stood on, which strikes me as a remarkably modern arrangement for the middle of the 16th century. The shops themselves were not modest affairs. The north end of the bridge closest to the city hosted the more upmarket establishments, fine goods quality merchandise, the kind of thing that attracted serious buyers. Records show a haberdasher, a draper, a hosier. There was reportedly an apple seller at the Southwark end with an official licence specifically for selling apples that passers-by might, the record suggest with a certain delicate ambiguity, want to hurl at the structure directly ahead of them, that structure being the Great Stone Gate. And what sat on top of the Great Stone Gate is the part of this story that makes London Bridge truly unlike any street that has existed before or since. The heads. I want to take a moment here because this is the detail that people always fixate on when they first encounter the history of Tudor London Bridge, and I think it deserves more than the standard treatment of breathless shock followed by a quick pivot to something less disturbing. The practice of displaying the severed heads of traitors on the gates of London Bridge began in 1305, when the head of William Wallace, the Scottish knight, whose story you may know from a certain very dramatic and not entirely historically accurate film, was placed on a pike above the drawbridge tower. It continued with varying levels of activity for the next 3.5 centuries. By 1558 the heads were displayed on the Great Stone Gate at the Southwark end of the bridge, where travellers arriving from the south would see them first, which was of course entirely the point. The process for those who have not encountered it was grimly technical. The heads were first parboiled, boiled briefly in water, and then coated in tar to slow decomposition, and preserve them against the elements. They were then mounted on iron spikes or wooden pikes above the gate, where they remained for weeks or months at a time. A city official with the title of Master of the Heads, a job that must have required a very particular kind of equanimity, was responsible for the installation, maintenance, and eventual disposal of the display. When the heads had served their purpose, he removed them and threw them into the river below. The practice had touched some of the most famous figures of the Tudor age. Thomas More, scholar, humanist, one of the finest minds of 16th-century Europe, a man who had served as Henry VIII's Lord Chancellor, before his conscience became too expensive to keep, was beheaded on Tower Hill in July 1535. His head was displayed on London Bridge for a month. His daughter, Margaret Roper, could not leave it there. What she did next is one of the most quietly extraordinary acts of love and defiance in the entire Tudor period. She bribed the official whose job it was to throw the head into the Thames, paid him to give it to her instead, and took her father's remains home by barge. For the rest of her life she died 9 years later. In 1544 she kept his head preserved in spices as a relic of the man who had chosen principle over survival. When she was buried, his head went with her. It now rests, if historians have traced the lineage correctly, in a vault beneath a church in Canterbury. I cannot tell that story without pausing for a moment. Not because it is gruesome, but because it is so profoundly human. A daughter who could not let her father's death be the last word written on his life, who could not walk past that gate every day knowing what was mounted above it and do nothing. The heads for Tudor Londoners were officially a deterrent, a warning to anyone tempted by treasonous thoughts about what awaited them. And on one level that is exactly what they were. Henry VIII used them as punctuation marks in his reign, the heads of John Fisher and Thomas More in 1535, of Thomas Cromwell in 1540. Each one a message readable to anyone who crossed that bridge with eyes open. But here is the thing that strikes me sitting with this history in the quiet of tonight. The heads were also, according to every foreign visitor who wrote about them, a tourist attraction. Paul Hentzner, that careful German lawyer, counted more than 30 of them in 1598. He noted their presence in his travel account the same way a modern visitor to London might note the changing of the guard as an unusual sight, a local curiosity, something worth recording for the people back home. There was apparently a brisk trade in people, pointing out which head belonged to whom, for those willing to pay a guide for the information. And this is where I think the real psychological history of Tudor London lives, not in the horror we feel looking back, which is genuine and appropriate, but in the normalization that time and repetition create in any society. People walked past those heads every day on their way to work. Merchants on the bridge ate their breakfast within sight of them. Children grew up knowing they were there without thinking of them as remarkable. What does that do to a culture's relationship with mortality, with power? With the cost of descent, I do not think those questions have clean answers, but I think they are worth asking. The bridge was also, on top of everything else, a site of genuine danger that had nothing to do with the water below. It was one of the most congested points in the entire city. The roadway across the bridge was a mere 15 feet wide in most places, about the width of a modest living room, and through it passed an unrelenting stream of pedestrians, carts, horses, livestock being driven to market, hawkers with goods balanced on poles across their shoulders, travellers arriving from every county south of the Thames, and the occasional nobleman whose servants were supposed to clear a path but frequently could not. Traffic in the modern sense of the word simply did not move on London Bridge. It compressed, it ground against itself. It created bottlenecks so severe that the journey across less than 1,000 feet, remember, you could walk it in 3 minutes on an empty road, could take the better part of an hour when the bridge was busy. And the bridge was almost always busy. Enterprising Londoners responded to this congestion in the way enterprising Londoners have always responded to captive audiences. They sold things. They sold food to people stuck in traffic. They sold ale. They sold services. The bridge was in the best possible sense a commercial ecosystem built on inconvenience, and it thrived. One more detail before we leave this extraordinary place, because it captures, I think, better than anything else, the peculiar genius of Tudor London's ability to turn any situation to some practical use. The ferocious rush of water through the bridge's starlings, the same current that capsized boats and drowned boatmen, the same force that made shooting the bridge synonymous with reckless gambling with your life, that water was eventually harnessed. In 1582, a Dutch engineer named Peter Morris installed a water wheel beneath the northern arch of the bridge powered by the tidal rush. It was designed to pump Thames water directly into the homes of nearby residents, the first piped water supply in the history of London. The most dangerous part of the bridge, the part that had killed people for centuries, became the thing that brought water to people's houses. Tudor London had a gift for that particular kind of inversion, taking a problem and quietly inventively turning it into something useful. Not always, not for everyone, but often enough to make you think about how much of what we call progress is really just an accumulation of small, stubborn refusals to accept that a thing cannot be otherwise. There is a phrase that survived from this period used by London watermen, and written into at least one contemporary account to describe the temperament required for life on and around London Bridge. They called it a bold heart and a clean pair of heels, which I think is as good a description of the Tudor Londoner's general approach to existence as you're likely to find anywhere. Bold enough to cross the bridge, quick enough to move when the cart came, and always keeping one eye on the water below. The bridge connected two worlds, but it was not neutral territory. Everything that passed over it, every merchant, every pilgrim, every message from the court, every rumour about the dying Queen at Whitehall, had to run the gauntlet of that street in the sky, that impossible, overcrowded, tar-scented, water-roaring stretch of stone, where 350 years of London had left their marks. And speaking of the water, it crossed the Thames itself, that river, which was simultaneously the city's highway, its marketplace, its sewer, and its mirror. There is far more to say. Because the river that flowed beneath London Bridge was not just a backdrop to this city's story, it was in many ways the story. Its moods shaped London's days, its currents carried its commerce, its tides recorded its weather, and along its banks in the year 1558 things were happening that will tell us more about this city and about the people who called it home than any bridge or palace or proclamation ever could. Come with me to the water. Every great city has a secret. New York has its subway, that dark underworld of noise and speed that most tourists never truly understand until they have lived above it, long enough to stop noticing it. Paris has its catacombs, 6 million people stacked in silence beneath the streets of the living. Rome has its layering, that sensation of walking on top of centuries, each pavement stone a lid on something older and stranger beneath. Tudor London's secret was its river, not in the sense that people did not know it was there. The Thames was impossible to miss, impossible to ignore, impossible to live in London without in some way depending on. But the secret was in the contradiction it contained, because the Thames in 1558 was simultaneously the most beautiful thing about London and the most dangerous. It was the city's highway and its dumping ground, its source of food and a source of death, its pride and its open wound, and understanding that contradiction really sitting with it tells you more about how Tudor Londoners actually experienced their city than any map or chronicle ever could. Let me start with the beauty, because it was real. The river that flowed through London in 1558 was wider and shallower than the Thames you would see today if you stood on Waterloo Bridge looking east. The great embankments that now compress and deepen the river were not built until the Victorian era. Without them, the Thames spread itself more generously across its banks, breathing in and out with the tides in a slow rhythm that shaped the daily schedule of every person who lived near it. And the tides mattered. The Thames is a tidal river even today, but in Tudor London that tidal rhythm was the pulse of the city's commerce. Merchants did not simply decide to ship goods upriver or downriver at will. They watched the tide. They planned around it. The twice-daily ebb and flow of the river determined when ships could enter the port, when cargo could be loaded or unloaded, when the great barges that carried wool from the warehouses of the city to the waiting ships in the estuary could safely move. By the mid-16th century, a survey recorded that over 40,000 men earned their living on or directly around the Thames. 40,000. In a city of 120,000 people, that is a staggering proportion. More than 1 in 3 of the working population bound in some way to the river and its moods. The north bank between London Bridge and the Tower of London was lined with specialised wharves, each dedicated to a particular kind of trade so that the whole system of commerce could function without constant confusion. There was Bear Quay, where ships from Portugal unloaded their cargo of wine and olive oil. Gibson's Quay handled lead and tin. Somers Quay served the merchants from Flanders, bringing cloth and luxury goods from the continent. Each wharf had its own character, its own rhythms, its own community of workers who showed up before dawn and left after dark. Downstream at Billingsgate, the fish market had been operating since at least the medieval period, a sprawling, chaotic, magnificently smelly enterprise that began before sunrise every morning, and was by the early hours already generating the kind of noise that could wake a man sleeping 2 streets away. The fish came in overnight from the coast, from the river itself, from the North Sea. By the time most of London was eating breakfast, the fishmongers of Billingsgate had already done half a day's work. The market was famous for 2 things: its fish, and the language of the women who sold it. The fishwives of Billingsgate had by general agreement across all of Tudor London the most spectacularly profane mouths in the city. Their vocabulary of insult was apparently so inventive, so comprehensive, so impressively creative in its deployment of English, in its rawer registers, that the historian Raphael Holinshed mentioned them by name in his chronicles written just a few years after our story. Billingsgate language became a recognised category of expression in Tudor England, shorthand for the kind of things you said when you were truly comprehensively done with someone. I find this oddly endearing. These women who got up in the dark to handle frozen fish in an era before gloves that actually kept your hands warm, who haggled and competed and held their own in a market dominated by guild structures and male authority, of course their language was fierce. Their circumstances required it. The men on the water had their own distinct culture. The Thames watermen, those thousands of boatmen who operated the wherries and ferries and barges that formed London's water taxi system, were by 1558 a formally recognised professional class. An Act of Parliament in 1555 had established a company to govern their trade, set the rules of the 7-year apprenticeship required to work the river, and regulate the fares they could charge. A standard wherry was 22.5 feet long, sharp at the bow, and could carry up to 5 passengers. Normally rowed by 2 men with long oars, though shorter cross-river trips might be handled by a single waterman, using what they called sculls. At the 55 recognised plying places, the stairs and jetties where passengers could hail a boat, watermen competed aggressively for custom crying out across the water in a way that became as much a part of the Thames soundscape as the lapping of waves and the creak of rope. Oars, oars, sculls, oars. If you have ever sat near a busy taxi rank and listened to the competition for fares, you have some sense of the atmosphere, except this one smelled of river mud and fish, and the vehicles were wooden, and the road beneath them was always moving. The watermen were by reputation a remarkable breed. London museum historians describe them as knowledgeable, skilled, deeply attuned to the complex tidal patterns of the Thames, and also, if the contemporary accounts are honest, occasionally saucy, to the point of rudeness, competitive to the point of outright aggression, and fiercely protective of their territory on the water. They were not men who took slights quietly. They were also in their way the arteries of the city. The royal palaces were strung along the Thames precisely because the river was so much faster and more reliable than London's congested unpaved roads. Whitehall, Greenwich, the Tower, Westminster, all connected by water, all accessible within a reasonable journey by barge. The Queen's own royal watermen, a select group who handled the royal barges, were among the most prestigious working people in London, their red livery marking them out on the river as clearly as any coat of arms marked a nobleman on land. But here is where the contradiction I mentioned at the beginning becomes impossible to ignore any longer. This same river, this highway, this food source and commerce engine and royal thoroughfare, was also where everything in London eventually went. Every piece of refuse, every dead animal, every fragment of rotting food, every substance that people needed to get rid of and had nowhere particular to put all of it, made its way sooner or later to the Thames. The Fleet River, one of the Thames's tributaries that ran through the city from north to south, had already become what one early 17th-century description called a notorious sewer, clogged with the waste of slaughterhouses and tanneries and the thousands of people who lived along its banks. It flowed directly into the Thames, contributing its particular character to the river's complicated cocktail. The City of London had since at least the reign of Henry VII appointed a conservator of the Thames, technically the Lord Mayor, whose job was to protect the river's integrity. As far back as 1489 laws existed to prevent the worst abuses. There were fines technically for those who dumped filth directly into the water, but between the law as written and London's daily reality lay a gap wide enough to sail a barge through. The problem was scale pure and simple. 120,000 people generate an extraordinary quantity of waste. Night soil collectors, the men with carts who came around before dawn to empty the city's privies, did their rounds, and some of that material made it out to farmland as fertilizer. But not all of it. By no means all of it. And the tributaries that fed the Thames had no such collection system at all. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to simply react with revulsion and leave it there, but that would miss something important about how Tudor Londoners actually understood and experienced the situation. They knew. They absolutely knew the river was polluted. The miasma theory of disease, the belief that bad air rather than contaminated water caused illness, meant they did not understand exactly why the river was dangerous. But they understood that it was. The term corrupt water appeared regularly in medical advice of the period. Physicians warned against drinking river water directly. The Tudors were wary of untreated Thames water in a way that has sometimes been misrepresented as ignorance. It was not ignorance. It was a different explanatory framework arriving at a partially correct conclusion. Think of it this way. They were right that the water was dangerous. They were wrong about exactly why. But being wrong about the mechanism while being right about the outcome is not the same thing as not knowing. And yet the river provided London's water supply alongside wells that were themselves often contaminated by seepage from the cesspits and privies nearby. There was no clean alternative for most of the city's population. The wealthy could afford to have water brought in from cleaner sources outside the city. Everyone else used what was available. Now I want to tell you about something that happened in 1564, just 6 years after our year of 1558, because it illuminates something about the Thames that I think is genuinely extraordinary and also somewhat absurd in the way that only history can be. In December of that year, in the grip of a severe winter that would later be understood as part of what climate historians call the Little Ice Age, the Thames froze solid, not partially, not the edges, solidly and completely from bank to bank from London Bridge all the way to Westminster. The chronicler Raphael Holinshed recorded it with careful precision. The frost began on the 21st of December. By New Year's Eve, people were walking across the river on foot. By early January, boys were playing football on the ice between London Bridge and Westminster. And Elizabeth I, the new queen, 6 years into her reign, all of 25 years old in 1564, went out onto the frozen Thames to practice archery. Let that image settle for a moment, because I think it is one of the most unexpectedly perfect images in Tudor history. A queen who had grown up with uncertainty and danger at every turn, who had survived the reigns of her brother and sister by keeping very still and saying very little, who had only recently inherited this complicated, magnificent, smelly, contested city, standing on the frozen surface of its great river, shooting at targets on the ice. There is something in that image that feels almost like defiance, or joy, or both at once. She had inherited a river that was simultaneously London's greatest asset and its most persistent problem. She had inherited a city that was extraordinary and ungovernable and alive in ways that no amount of legislation could fully contain. And on a January morning in 1564 she stood on the frozen surface of all of it and shot arrows at a mark. I have always loved that detail. By 1558, the tension between the Thames as lifeblood and the Thames as slow poison was not approaching crisis. That crisis would take another 3 centuries to fully manifest in the Victorian catastrophe, known as the Great Stink of 1858, exactly 300 years after our story begins. But the seeds of it were already in the ground, or more accurately already in the water. What strikes me most sitting with this history in the quiet of tonight is how fully the people of Tudor London had integrated that tension into their daily lives. They ate fish from the river and also deposited their refuse into it. They drank water from it cautiously and also celebrated when it froze solid enough to walk on. They feared its moods, the floods that came with certain tides, the sudden drop in temperature that could stop all river commerce in a day, and they also found their livelihoods in its rhythms. The river was not separate from the city. It was not backdrop or scenery. It was woven into the fabric of what London was in the same way that your own contradictions are woven into the fabric of who you are. The good and the bad, not cleanly separable, not arranged on opposite sides of a balance, but mixed together in something complicated and alive. That seems to me a very human condition. And Tudor London, for all its strangeness, for all the centuries of distance between its world and ours, was very deeply human. There is one more thing I want to tell you about the river before we leave it. A survey conducted near the end of the 16th century, close enough to 1558, to count as part of the same world, estimated that over 40,000 men earned their living on or around the Thames. 40,000 people whose daily bread depended on one river's cooperation. That river's longest single commercial journey began not in London, but somewhere along the English countryside, followed the wool trade from inland to port, flowed through the counting houses of Cheapside merchants, and ended somewhere in the markets of Antwerp or Lisbon, or the Ottoman ports of the Eastern Mediterranean, having passed through the hands of a dozen different people along the way. The Thames, in other words, was not just a London river. It was a thread in a global fabric that stretched across the known world of 1558. Which is, when you think about it, a remarkable thing for a body of water to be. And speaking of what Londoners put into their bodies, because this city's relationship with food and drink in 1558 is its own astonishing story, what the residents of this city ate, what they feared to eat, what they ate when they had no choice, and what the wealthy consumed that would make a modern nutritionist's eyes water. All of that is waiting for us just around the corner, because Tudor London ran on ale and bread and fear and occasionally something much stranger, and that is a story worth knowing. Alright, let us talk about food. And I say that with genuine enthusiasm because the food history of Tudor London in 1558 is one of those subjects that starts out sounding like a dry historical footnote and ends up being a window into everything class, religion, medicine, global trade, vanity, and what might be the most magnificently misguided dental care trend in the history of Western civilization. I promise I will get to the teeth. But first, let me set the scene. The working day in Tudor London started early, well before sunrise for many, before the bells had finished their morning call, for a good number of the city's craftsmen and market workers. And on most days for most people, it started with the same thing it had started with the day before and the week before and the month before that: pottage. If you have never encountered the word pottage, was essentially a thick soup or porridge, a broad category that covered everything from a barely acceptable gruel of oats boiled in water to something more generous, a pot with onions, cabbage, peas, beans, whatever herbs were available, and on a good day a heel of bread dropped in to thicken it, or a scrap of salted pork if the week had been kind. It was the staple of the English poor and a reasonable portion of the English middling sort. The ale historian who wrote most comprehensively about Tudor food described pottage as the Tudor equivalent of the sandwich, not glamorous, not remarkable, but utterly central to daily life, across every social tier below the gentry. The poor ate it plain, the wealthy. And this is where Tudor food gets genuinely interesting, because the well-off in 1558 were deeply invested in making even their pottage communicate their status, added almonds. Saffron imported from the Middle East at significant expense, ginger from the Spice Islands, a splash of wine from France or the Rhine. The pot on the fire was the same. What went into it revealed everything about whose house you were sitting in. Bread was the other daily anchor. But again, not all bread was equal, and the Tudors understood this with a precision that bordered on the theological. At the bottom of the bread hierarchy, and there was absolutely a hierarchy, was what contemporaries bluntly called the bread of desperation, a coarse loaf made from barley or rye, heavy and dark, sometimes supplemented with ground acorns or dried peas when grain ran short. The food writer and historian who compiled observations on Tudor England in the 1570s noted with something between sympathy and alarm that in hard times labourers ate bread made from a mixture of beans, oats, and whatever could be ground into something resembling flour. Move up the social scale and the bread improved, wheaten bread increasingly white as the flour grew finer, until at the very top of the table you reach what was called manchet, a small, delicate, brilliantly white roll of pure wheat flour, soft inside, and perfectly formed the kind of bread that announced your household's prosperity more effectively than almost anything else on the table. The contrast between a manchet on a lord's plate and an oat barley loaf on a labourer's was not merely a difference in taste. It was a statement about who you were and where you stood. There is particular detail from Yale's food history research that I keep returning to, because it captures something essential about Tudor attitudes toward food and class. Contemporaries apparently found it worrying, genuinely unsettling, that during the good harvests of the late 1500s, labourers had begun to expect wheaten bread rather than the barley bread traditionally considered appropriate to their station. The word used in one surviving document is that this expectation was worrying, not understandable or even costly, worrying. Because food in Tudor London was never just food, it was social order made edible. Now here is a question I want to sit with for a moment. What did you actually drink? Not in terms of personal preference. in terms of what was available to you in 1558 London that was safe? The answer for virtually everyone, regardless of wealth or social status, was ale, not water. The Thames, as we've already established, was what it was. The city's wells were frequently contaminated by their proximity to cesspits and the general chaos of Tudor urban sanitation. Water for a Tudor Londoner carried an entirely reasonable and not entirely incorrect association with disease. The miasma theory, the same framework that told them bad smells caused illness, had taught them that water being visible and tasteable, evidence of corruption in many cases, was to be treated with caution. So they drank ale. Children drank ale. Elderly grandmothers drank ale. The apprentice who arrived at his master's shop at 6 a.m. drank ale with his breakfast. The woman nursing an infant drank ale. Everyone drank ale more or less all the time from morning until the candles went out at night. This sounds to a 21st century ear either admirable or catastrophic, depending on your perspective. The reality is more nuanced. Tudor ale, particularly small ale, the everyday variety, was brewed without hops and was very low in what we would call alcohol content. It was essentially a fermented grain drink closer to a thin, slightly tangy porridge water than to anything we would recognize as beer today. It provided calories which many people in 1558 London needed rather urgently. It was safer than water for practical reasons that the Tudors understood only partially, but that we now understand completely. The brewing process killed many of the pathogens that made untreated water lethal. In a world without that knowledge, they had arrived at the right answer by a combination of experience and instinct. Which is, and I say this with genuine respect for the process, a remarkably human way to solve a problem. The wealthy also drank wine imported from France, from the Rhine Valley, from Spain and Portugal. Claret Malmsey, sack, a kind of fortified wine from Iberia that would eventually become familiar to English drinkers for centuries to come. Wine glasses themselves, by 1558, were becoming an object of desire among those who could afford them. Thin-walled, delicately made glass, imported from Venice and Murano, so expensive that serving wine in one was a statement about your household almost as powerful as the wine itself. The poor drank from wooden cups or earthenware. The wealthy drank from Venetian glass. The gap between them was measured in fragility. But let us turn now to what happened to the people who could not cook at home. And in 1558 London, that was a significant portion of the population. Many of the city's poorer residents, single men, recent arrivals from the countryside, workers living in lodgings without kitchens or hearths, or any means of preparing food, depended entirely on what historians now call cook shops. The Tudor equivalent, in a phrase that historians use without irony, of fast food. The cook shops had existed in London since at least the 1100s. They were essentially commercial hearths, roaring fires, spits turning over them, cauldrons of stew bubbling beside them, and in front a counter or stall where you could buy what was hot and hand it someone coins and walk away eating it. No seats, no tables, no ceremony. You ate standing or you ate walking the way people at a street cart eat today, except the cart was a stone building, and what was turning on the spit was a side of mutton rather than a gyro. Historian Martha Carlin, who has written most carefully about medieval and early Tudor urban food, described them perfectly. It was meant to be eaten immediately like a hamburger and fries today. The only difference was that Tudor London had no concept of standardization, no inspection system worth speaking of, and a rather relaxed relationship with the question of whether what was in the pie was what the sign claimed. Contemporary complaints about cook shops, and there were many preserved in city records and in the writing of moralists who seemed to have an inexhaustible appetite for disapproving of other people's dinner arrangements, centered almost universally on two things: the quality of the food and the hygiene of the preparation. This is a remarkably modern complaint. The Tudor Londoner who muttered under his breath about the questionable meat in his pie from the cook shop off Cheapside was having a version of the same experience that people have today when they read health inspection scores on restaurant doors. By 1558, something new was beginning to emerge alongside the cook shops. Eating houses, proper establishments with tables and chairs where you could sit and eat something prepared specifically for you, were appearing in London for the first time. One Italian visitor, Alessandro Magno, who stayed in London in 1562 and recorded his impressions with the delight of someone genuinely surprised by how much he enjoyed himself, described a London inn that served roast meats, pies, fish, fruit, tarts, cheese, and what he called excellent wine, apparently delivered with a kind of cheerful competence that made the experience memorable enough to write about. London in 1558 was in the most literal sense learning how to go out to dinner, and given that this city would eventually produce some of the world's most extraordinary restaurant culture, I find that origin story quietly moving. There is one more chapter of the Tudor food story that I cannot leave out, and this is the one that when I first encountered it properly made me put down the book I was reading and just sit with it for a moment. The story of sugar and what it did to Tudor London's teeth. Sugar in 1558 was arriving in England in growing quantities from the East and West Indies, from Morocco, from Barbary. It was expensive. Contemporary sources compared it in value to pearls and fine spices, which is to say, it was traded in small quantities, carefully weighed, treated as a luxury ingredient rather than a basic commodity. And the wealthy who could afford it put it on everything, in their pottage, on their meat, in their wine, in their desserts, which range from the simply sweetened to the extravagantly sculpted elaborate marchpane creations, marchpane being an early form of marzipan shaped into castles and animals, and ships brought out between banquet courses to be admired before being eaten. The great households of Tudor England competed to produce the most impressive sugar sculptures, the most elaborate confections, the most extravagant deployment of this precious imported sweetener, the result playing out slowly across the teeth of everyone wealthy enough to indulge was entirely predictable in retrospect, and apparently entirely invisible at the time. Their teeth rotted, turned black, fell out, caused pain that the period's dentistry, which consisted largely of extraction with pliers if you were lucky and prayer if you were not, was poorly equipped to address. And here is the detail that I maintain is one of the strangest and most human things in the entire Tudor period. When the teeth of the wealthy began to turn black from their sugar consumption, people who could not afford sugar, people who had by pure economic circumstance perfect or near perfect white teeth, began to deliberately blacken their own teeth, with soot, with charcoal, with whatever pigment came to hand, because black teeth meant you could afford sugar, and if you could afford sugar you were clearly someone of consequence. I want you to just sit with that for a second. In 1558, London, a city already defined by its obsession with visible social status, with the right fabric and the right colour and the right bread on your table, people were voluntarily applying soot to their teeth to signal wealth they did not have. The Queen herself, as she grew older, and her love of sweets intensified, would eventually have teeth so blackened by decay that foreign ambassadors reported difficulty understanding her speech. A German traveller visiting England later in her reign described her teeth as black, and noted that this seemed a fault the English seemed to suffer from because of their great use of sugar. He meant it as an observation. It reads now as something between a diagnosis and a poem. And then, and this is the part that keeps me up at night in the best possible way, there was the toothpaste. The Tudor toothpaste designed to clean these sugar-damaged teeth, to polish and preserve them, to maintain whatever standard of dental hygiene the period was capable of achieving, was also made of sugar. I think about this often. not just as historical curiosity but as something that reveals a genuinely universal human pattern, the remedy that contains the cause of the problem, the solution that perpetuates what it is designed to solve. Tudor London was not unique in this. Every era has its version, but there is something about the image the Queen of England brushing her blackening teeth with sugar paste, while her courtiers painted their perfectly healthy teeth black to imitate her, that cuts through 4.5 centuries with remarkable directness. Status is strange, always has been, probably always will be. Before we move on, I want to mention one more element of the Tudor table that shaped daily life in ways that went far beyond the dinner plate. In 1558, what you ate on any given day was not entirely your choice. The church, or rather the complicated religious landscape left behind by the reformations of the preceding decades, still governed the calendar of eating. Fridays were fast days, no meat, only fish. Saturdays, too, in most cases. During Lent, restrictions intensified. On the eve of certain saints' days, meat was forbidden. This sounds purely religious, but it had a very practical economic logic running beneath it. England's fishing industry depended on consistent demand. If everyone ate meat 7 days a week, the fishermen, the watermen, the coastal villages, the whole infrastructure of England's marine economy faced ruin. The fasting laws were partly piety and partly fish trade policy, and the government knew it. In 1555, Edward VI had formally decreed Fridays and Saturdays as non-meat days. Elizabeth I in 1563 would add Wednesdays with a penalty of 3 months in prison for breaking the law, though in a detail that strikes me as very Tudor in its pragmatism, one could legally buy a license to eat meat on fast days, the cost of the license scaled to your social status, which meant in practical terms that the wealthy could eat whatever they wanted on any day they chose for a fee, and the poor ate fish whether they wanted to or not. Even the calendar of eating, it turned out, was a function of how much money you had, and so we've arrived through pottage and ale and blackened teeth and legally mandated fish Fridays at one of the central truths of what it meant to live in Tudor London in 1558. Everything, the bread, the drink, the plate. It was served on the day of the week you were allowed to eat. It was coded with information about who you were. Not in a subtle way. Not in the way that modern class distinctions sometimes work through implication and inference, but openly, visibly, materially in the grain of the loaf and the colour of the goblet and the state of your teeth. Food in this world was a language, and everyone in the city read it fluently. The question that has stayed with me sitting with all of this is a simpler one than it might first appear. Were they happy eating it? Not the wealthy with their marchpane castles and their Venetian wine glasses. I suspect they were most days fairly pleased with themselves, but the labourer with his barley bread and his bowl of pottage and his cup of small ale sitting in his cramped lodging off some narrow London lane when that bowl was warm and the bread was fresh and the ale was cold and the day's work was done, was there pleasure in it? I think the answer quietly and without sentimentality is yes. There usually is. That warmth is one of the oldest things about being human. It predates the Tudors by several thousand years, and it has outlasted them. And in 1558, London, tucked into cookshops and tavern corners and draughty tenement rooms, it was just as real as it is tonight, wherever you are in whatever quiet space you have made for yourself to listen to these stories. Settle in a little deeper, because as real as hunger was in this city, and it was very real for many, the city also had its own particular ways of keeping fear at bay, its own physicians, its own diseases, and its own utterly remarkable responses to both. The story of what was killing Tudor Londoners, and of the extraordinary improvised, sometimes brilliant, sometimes completely wrong-headed ways they tried to stop it, is next. Oh, something woke you in the night. Not a sound from outside, not a dream half remembered, not the ordinary creaking of a house at rest. Something inside your own body. A strange unease. a premonition, almost the kind of feeling that settles over you before you have the words to name what is wrong. For a Tudor Londoner in 1558, that particular sensation carried a weight that we, with our antibiotics and our emergency rooms and our germ theory, cannot fully reconstruct. Because in this city in this year, the thing that woke you in the night might be nothing. A chill from a draughty window, a bit of bad pork from the cook shop, or it might be the beginning of something that would carry you to a churchyard within 48 hours. And the most frightening part, the part that I keep returning to, when I think about what daily life in Tudor London actually felt like in the body, is that you would not know which one it was until several hours had passed. Sometimes not until morning, sometimes not at all. Let us begin with the disease that genuinely terrified the Tudor world in a way that even the plague, which was more deadly in the aggregate, somehow did not. The sweating sickness. In 1558, the sweating sickness had not struck London for 7 years. Its last epidemic was in 1551, but its memory sat fresh and raw in the minds of anyone who had lived through it. Unlike most diseases of the period which tended to hit the poor hardest, the sweating sickness had an unnerving democratic quality. It killed rich and poor with roughly equal enthusiasm. In some outbreaks, it seemed to prefer the healthy and young over the already weakened, and it moved with a speed that the period had no framework to comprehend. Dr. John Caius, a royal physician who witnessed and documented the 1551 outbreak in Shrewsbury, and wrote the most detailed account, we have described the disease with a clinical precision that still feels urgent across the gap of centuries. It began, he wrote, with a strange general unease, a premonition of oncoming horror. Those are essentially his words, followed by violent headache, shivering, aching limbs. Then within 1 to 3 hours the sweating began, drenching, unstoppable, accompanied by a racing pulse, delirium, and a fever that seemed to burn through the body's resources with terrifying efficiency. Death could occur, Caius recorded, anywhere from 3 to 18 hours after the first symptoms appeared. If the patient survived 24 hours, recovery was usually complete. In the 1551 outbreak, the disease killed some 900 people in Shrewsbury alone before reaching London. The speed of it. That is the thing that haunts me. The contemporary phrase, merry at dinner, dead at supper, was not metaphor. It was observation. What made the sweating sickness additionally strange, and what still troubles the scientists who have tried to identify it retrospectively, is that it appeared in England in 1485 and simply vanished after 1551, never to return in recognizable form. 5 outbreaks across 66 years, then nothing. Modern researchers have proposed hantavirus as a candidate, a rodent-borne disease capable of producing rapid respiratory failure, but no definitive identification has ever been made. It remains one of the genuine medical mysteries of Tudor England, a disease that came killed on its own terms and departed without leaving enough evidence for us to fully understand it even now. What it left behind, though, was unmistakable: a generation of Londoners who understood at a level deeper than thought that health was provisional, that the body you woke up with in the morning was not guaranteed to be the body that lay down at night. The plague was older and better understood in the sense that Londoners had lived alongside it long enough to have developed habits and responses, even if those responses were not always effective. By 1558, the Great Black Death of 2 centuries earlier was distant enough to be history rather than memory. But the plague itself was not history. It was a presence, a recurring visitor, a shadow that fell across the city every generation or so and reminded everyone of its power. 5 years after our story begins in 1563, when Elizabeth I was 5 years into her reign and London was still adjusting to a new world, the plague returned with a force that shocked even a city that thought it knew what to expect. By the peak of that outbreak, more than 1,000 Londoners were dying each week. The physician William Bullen, writing during the epidemic, recorded a beggar's testimony of the streets wagons and carts and horses moving out of London, full laden with young children for fear of the Black Pestilence. The Queen herself, who, as we will discover shortly, had good personal reason to fear infectious disease, left London for Windsor Castle, and at Windsor she ordered a gallows erected at the city gates. Anyone arriving from plague-stricken London would be hanged. That detail always stops me. A queen ordering her subjects hanged not for treason, but for the crime of potentially carrying disease. It tells you better than any statistical table what the plague meant to the people who lived in its shadow. When the 1563 outbreak finally ran its course, it had killed somewhere between 18,000 and 24,000 people, roughly 1/4 of London's entire population, in a single year, in a city of about 100,000 souls. But plague and sweating sickness were only the most dramatic killers. The background noise of death in Tudor London in 1558 was broader and more constant than any single epidemic. Smallpox, tuberculosis called consumption in the period and recognised by its slow wasting progress, typhus which thrived in the crowded lice-ridden tenements of the city's poorer quarters, dysentery which killed children with particular efficiency, measles which could spiral into something far worse in a body already weakened by malnutrition, and a constellation of unnamed fevers that the period lumped under general categories because the taxonomy of disease had not yet been developed to distinguish them. Life expectancy at birth in Tudor England has been estimated at somewhere between 35 and 40 years. But that number is pulled down dramatically by the extraordinary rate of infant and child mortality. Somewhere between 1/3 and half of all children born in this period did not survive to the age of 16. The grief implicit in that statistic, the ordinary recurring devastating grief of burying children, was so endemic to Tudor life that it is almost impossible to fully absorb from where we sit today. I think about this sometimes when I encounter the surviving records, the baptism register entries followed weeks or months later by burial entries for the same name over and over in the same family's record. 3 children born, 2 buried before reaching 5. A family rebuilt, then diminished again. The mathematics of loss worked out in ink in a parish register, dry and factual, and somehow more devastating for its quietness. Now, how did Tudor London actually respond to all of this? This is the part of the story that I find simultaneously the most fascinating and the most complicated to tell fairly. Because the easy version, the version where we simply laugh at Tudor medicine as ignorant superstition, misses something important about what these people were trying to do, and why some of what they did actually worked, even if for the wrong reasons. Tudor medical practice operated within what is called the theory of the 4 humours, originally articulated by the ancient Greek physicians Hippocrates and Galen, and carried forward through centuries of Islamic scholarship. Before reaching Renaissance Europe, the humoral theory held that the body contained 4 fundamental fluids: blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that health consisted of maintaining their proper balance. Illness meant an imbalance. Treatment meant restoring equilibrium. From this followed bloodletting, the practice of opening a vein or applying leeches to deliberately drain blood from the body, on the theory that an excess of blood was causing the imbalance. In Tudor London, bloodletting was so central to medical practice that the red and white striped pole outside barbershops, which you still see today, originally advertised the service. Red for the blood let, white for the bandages applied afterward. What now signals a haircut once signalled a medical procedure. The 4 humours also explained why astrology featured in Tudor diagnosis. Different zodiacal signs were believed to govern different parts of the body. A responsible physician in 1558 would consider the position of the stars and planets when planning a treatment, not because he was foolish, but because he was working within the most sophisticated explanatory framework his culture had developed for understanding the human body. Dismissing this as mere superstition is, I think, a mistake. It was incorrect. But it was organized internally consistent, and it gave practitioners a methodology, a way of thinking systematically about illness, rather than simply reacting to it. Some of what they did accidentally worked. Herbs that we now know contain genuine medicinal compounds were deployed sometimes correctly. Willow bark, which contains the precursor to aspirin, was used for fever and pain. Honey was applied to wounds. Certain moulds that grew on bread in medieval and early modern kitchens had antibiotic properties that nobody knew they had, but the bread was eaten and the mould consumed alongside it, with effects that were occasionally beneficial for reasons nobody at the time could articulate. The theory was wrong, the practice was inconsistent, and some of the outcomes purely by chance approximated the right thing. In London specifically, in 1558, the formal medical profession was organised in a hierarchy that would have been legible to any Tudor citizen. At the top sat the physicians, university-trained, their qualifications regulated by the Royal College of Physicians, which Henry VIII had established in 1518. These were the men you consulted if you were wealthy and unwell, and wanted something written down about your condition. Their fees placed them well beyond the reach of most Londoners. Below them the surgeons and barber surgeons, a single company since Henry VIII, merged them in 1540, who performed the physical interventions, the bloodletting, the tooth extractions, the amputations when injury left no other option. The barber surgeons were skilled in ways the physicians sometimes were not, their knowledge accumulated through hands-on practice rather than classical texts. In a period when surgery had no anesthesia and no antiseptic technique, their survival rates were appalling by modern standards and remarkable by the standards of what was otherwise possible. Below them, the apothecaries, the pharmacists of their day selling medicines and compounds from their shops, offering free advice alongside the remedy regulated since 1526 by the Grocers' Company, in a relationship that tells you something about how the period categorized knowledge and commerce in relation to each other. And at the base of the whole system, invisible to the official records, but essential to the daily medical lives of the poor, the wise women, not witches in the lurid popular sense. Women with an inherited experiential knowledge of plants and their properties of remedies that had been passed from mother to daughter for generations, who offered consultation and treatment to the people who could not afford physicians and who found the barber surgeon's shop a terrifying and expensive option. The wise women were the primary healthcare providers for a significant portion of Tudor London's population, and the official medical profession's relationship with them ranged from grudging tolerance to active hostility, depending on the individual physician and the specific case. One official description of their practice, preserved from 1562, describes a London physician surveying 300 patients in St Bartholomew's and St Thomas's hospitals, of whom 120 had been damaged limbs, crooked wounds worsening by what he attributed to incompetent treatment from unlicensed practitioners. His frustration is palpable across 4.5 centuries. The wise women who had treated these people were, in his professional view, responsible for catastrophic harm, what his account does not include, and what the historians who have worked most carefully on this period consistently note, is any acknowledgement that these patients might not have gone to wise women first if the alternatives had been financially accessible. The gap between official condemnation and practical reality was, as usual in Tudor London, considerable. There is one more medical story from this period that I cannot leave unmentioned because it involves the Queen herself, and is one of those moments where history becomes startlingly vivid. In October of 1562, 4 years after our story begins, Elizabeth I contracted smallpox. She was 29 years old. She had no direct heir. The succession question, already the most anxious political topic in England, immediately became the most anxious political topic in all of Europe. If Elizabeth died of smallpox, who became queen? The answer in 1562 was genuinely unclear and genuinely frightening. The treatment she received for smallpox was by Tudor standards the most advanced available. She was wrapped in red cloth. I want to make sure that lands properly the most sophisticated medical treatment that England's finest physicians could offer their queen in the middle of the 16th century for a disease that was killing people all around her, was to wrap her in red cloth. The reasoning behind this treatment derived from a theory that red light had some curative property for pustular diseases, was sincerely believed by the men implementing it, including some of the most learned physicians in the country. Elizabeth survived. Whether because of the red cloth in spite of it, or through some combination of her own physical resilience and good fortune, is a question the surviving records cannot resolve. She survived, but with some facial scarring that would in the years to come contribute to her increasing reliance on the elaborate white makeup that became one of the defining visual elements of her later reign. The disease that nearly ended her queenship before it had properly begun left its mark. Not fatally, but indelibly. What strikes me most about Tudor London's relationship with disease, having spent time in the records, having read the accounts of physicians and patients, and worried family members and city officials trying to contain epidemics with bonfires of corrupt air and gallows at the city gates, is not the ignorance, though the ignorance was real, and its consequences were devastating. What strikes me is the persistence. The city kept going. After every epidemic, after every outbreak of sweating sickness or plague or smallpox, the survivors rebuilt their households, reopened their shops, sent their children back to the streets. The burial registers fill with names, and then a few months later resume their ordinary rhythm. Life reasserted itself, not because people had stopped being afraid, but because they had developed over generations a relationship with mortality that allowed them to be afraid and keep moving at the same time. That is, I think, a harder and more important quality than courage. Courage implies the absence of fear. What the people of Tudor London had was something different, a functional relationship with the knowledge that health was always provisional, that any morning might be the last one, and that this was simply the nature of the world they had been born into. They were not stoic about it, not if you read the letters and diaries carefully. They were afraid, they mourned, they prayed, they worried. But they also got up and kept going, and in that keeping going there is something that I find genuinely moving about them across all the distance of time. We have spent a great deal of time now with the experiences that Tudor London shared across all classes, disease being the great democratizer touching the palace, and the tenement with only modest discrimination. But there is a part of this city that operated in deliberate, almost theatrical separation from the rest, a world of its own rules, its own pleasures, its own particular darkness, sitting right on the other side of the river that we crossed in our minds at the very beginning of this journey. Suffolk after dark is waiting. And what happened in those streets, in those yards, in those low-ceilinged rooms along the south bank of the Thames, the things the official city wanted to have available, without acknowledging that they had them, is a story that will tell you perhaps more clearly than anything else we have covered exactly what Tudor London was willing to do and willing to pretend it was not doing. Stay with me. Here is something that modern historians keep returning to, almost with a sense of genuine bewilderment when they study Tudor London's relationship with public punishment. The pickpockets did their best work at the hangings. Let that sit for a second. The city's most prolific thieves, the cut-purses, the young men known colloquially as Tyburn blossoms, because they so reliably appeared wherever an execution was scheduled, gathered at the gallows, not despite the fact that the person being hanged was usually a thief, but because the crowd's attention was elsewhere. While 30,000 people craned their necks toward the scaffold, focused on the ritual of state justice unfolding above them, the men in the audience who made their living from other people's purses found the conditions ideal. The irony was not lost on Tudor observers, it was simply accepted. Which tells you a great deal, I think, about what public execution actually was in 1558 London and what it was not. The official theory of Tudor punishment was deterrence. The logic was straightforward. If the consequences of crime were sufficiently terrible and sufficiently public, rational people would choose not to commit crimes. Display the body, leave the heads on the bridge, cart the condemned through 3 miles of crowded streets before the hanging so that the maximum number of people could see them and draw appropriate lessons. Make suffering visible, make death a spectacle. By 1558, this system had been operating in London for generations. Tyburn, located about 3 miles west of Newgate Prison, roughly where Marble Arch stands today, was the city's principal execution ground for ordinary criminals. The journey from prison to gallows had evolved into its own elaborate ritual, the condemned loaded onto an open horse-drawn cart, the procession moving west, through crowds that often numbered in the thousands, the whole journey taking up to 3 hours, despite covering a distance you could walk in under an hour simply because the streets were so packed with people who'd come to watch. At St Giles, roughly halfway along the route, the cart traditionally stopped at an inn. The condemned were allowed a last drink, a bowl of nutty brown ale, according to one vivid period description. Some of them apparently made jokes. "I'll buy you a pint on the way back," a condemned man once reportedly called to the innkeeper's customers as the cart moved off again. The crowd loved a prisoner who showed bravery, loved one who made speeches, who displayed defiance, who laughed at the noose. There was an entire vocabulary of approval available to the Tyburn crowd, cheering, gesturing, throwing things, and a vocabulary of disapproval for those who wept or begged, or seemed in the popular judgment insufficiently dignified in the face of death. This is the thing that the deterrence theory completely failed to predict. The executed criminal was often in the crowd's moral imagination a kind of hero. Not the villain of the story, the star. The hangings took place 8 times a year, and scholars who have studied them most carefully describe them as, by the mid-Tudor period, carnivalesque occasions in which the normative message intended by the authorities is reappropriated and inverted by an irreverent crowd. In plain English, the state staged a morality play about the consequences of law-breaking, and the audience rewrote it into something entirely different. Something that celebrated the condemned's last moments of defiance, that turned a walk to the gallows into a procession of darkly festive human theatre, that made pickpockets rich, precisely because the whole thing had become, against every intention of its designers, a really excellent day out. Vendors sold food, minstrels played. Seats in purpose-built viewing stands could be rented. One grandstand, known with wonderful Tudor directness as Mother Proctor's Pew, reportedly earned £5,000 in a single day from a particularly anticipated execution. That is the equivalent of roughly £450,000 today from a seating arrangement at a hanging. But let me step back from the carnival, because there is a layer beneath all that noise and dark comedy that matters more than the spectacle. What were the actual crimes that brought people to Tyburn? Historians who have worked through the court records from the Tudor period have found something that reframes the whole enterprise once you see it. During Elizabeth I's reign, roughly 3/4 of all those sent to the gallows were there for theft. Not murder, not treason, not the dramatic crimes of high politics and religious dissent that tend to dominate the narrative. Theft. The the taking of something worth more than a shilling the threshold at which petty theft became a hanging offence. 1 shilling. In 1558 that was approximately 1 day's wages for a labourer who was doing reasonably well. The mathematics of that threshold are, I think, worth sitting with quietly for a moment. A city of 120,000 people, a third of them in poverty, all of them living in close quarters, in a society that had just dismantled its primary welfare system with the dissolution of the monasteries, and hanging as the prescribed response to stealing something worth the equivalent of a good day's pay. The cutpurse who worked the Tyburn crowds was not typically a criminal by vocation. More likely he was a young man with limited options and a quick pair of hands who had done what the city's circumstances offered. The difference between the person hanging on the rope and the person in the crowd stealing from a distracted neighbour's belt was not always a moral difference. It was sometimes a difference of luck, of timing, of whether the wrong constable noticed on the wrong morning. I do not think that makes theft right. I think it makes the picture considerably more complicated than the official script allowed. The hierarchy of punishment in Tudor London was like everything else in this city organised by class. At the very top of the social scale, when nobility committed crimes, including crimes that would have sent a commoner to Tyburn without ceremony, they were beheaded instead of hanged. Beheading was considered more honourable, presumably because the act of being hanged by the neck carried a kind of undignified helplessness that the upper classes preferred to avoid. For crimes of high treason, which in Tudor England was a capacious category that included not only plotting against the monarch, but also speaking the wrong words in the wrong company, following the wrong religion, at the wrong moment in history, the prescribed punishment was hanging, drawing, and quartering. The word drawing in this context meant being dragged through the streets to the execution site on a wooden board behind a horse. What followed was deliberately extreme in its design. As public theatre, the condemned was hanged to the point of near death, then cut down, still living, then subjected to further procedures, before finally being beheaded and divided into quarters, the parts sent to be displayed in different locations across the city. The explicit purpose, as stated in contemporary legal writings, was to demonstrate the absolute power of the crown over the body of those who defied it, to make the punishment so total, so public, so complete, that resistance became literally unthinkable. And during the reign of Mary I, who died in 1558, just as our story opens, 274 people had been burned at the stake for the crime of following the Protestant faith. The flames were, in a sense, theological argument conducted by the state. A sermon you could not argue with because you were standing in the middle of it. I want to be careful here not to minimize what burning meant for the people who died in it, but also not to reduce it to simple cruelty. Mary believed with absolute conviction that she was saving souls, that the people she burned were heading toward eternal damnation, if left unchallenged, and that temporal suffering was worth the eternal salvation she hoped to accomplish. The horror of the Marian burnings, and they were horrific, was not primarily the product of sadism. It was the product of perfect unyielding certainty, which might in some ways be more frightening. Not all Tudor punishment was lethal. Much of it was designed to mark the body rather than end it. Branding was widely used letters burned into the skin to announce to the world what you had done. A thief was branded with the letter T on the thumb or hand. A murderer received M on the cheek. A vagabond received V on the forehead. These were permanent visible records carried on the body for life, the state's way of writing its judgment directly onto the person who had defied it. The pillory was something else. A wooden frame with holes for the head and hands positioned in a public square or market, the person locked inside it, at the mercy of whoever was passing. In theory, the pillory exposed you to public censure. In practice, the nature of that censure depended heavily on what you had done and who you had done it to. A man convicted of informing against his neighbours might find the crowd pelting him with rotten food. A man convicted of what the crowd considered a sympathetic crime might find them cheering. There is a recorded case from 1561, 1 year after our story begins, of a man convicted of forgery who was whipped through the streets of Westminster, across London Bridge and through Southwark, a public procession of punishment that covered a significant portion of the city, making his shame visible to the maximum number of witnesses. In the same year, 2 men recently released from a mental institution claimed to be the risen Christ and St. Peter respectively. They too were whipped through the streets. I find that last one genuinely difficult to know what to do with. The cruelty of it is obvious. But so is something else, a society so anxious about the boundaries between sanity and madness, between religious enthusiasm and derangement, that it chose public humiliation as the response. Which tells you something, I think, about how Tudor London understood the relationship between the individual body and the social order. The body needed to be brought back into line, made to perform its correct social role, whether or not the mind inside it was capable of that performance. Along the north bank of the Thames at Wapping, somewhat east of the main city, there was another execution site that operated on entirely different principles from Tyburn. Here at a place called Execution Dock, those convicted of crimes committed at sea, primarily piracy and mutiny, met their end with a particularity that reflected the separate legal jurisdiction of the Admiralty Court. The condemned were marched in procession from Marshalsea Prison in Southwark across London Bridge past the Tower of London to the foreshore of the Thames at Wapping. The procession was led by the High Court Marshal or his deputy carrying a silver oar, the symbol of Admiralty authority made tangible, and carried through the streets as ceremony. At the dock, pirates were hanged with the shortened rope. This distinction matters. The shortened rope was not a technical accident. It was deliberate. A long drop would break the neck quickly, the death relatively fast. A shortened rope meant strangulation, a slow death from asphyxiation, the hanged man's body writhing at the end of the rope in what contemporaries called, with a certain grim poetry, the marshal's dance. After death, the bodies remained. The custom at Execution Dock was that the corpse stayed on the gallows until at least 3 tides had washed over it. For the most notorious offenders, the Admiralty would then order the body tarred, preserved against the elements, and suspended in an iron cage called a gibbet along the Thames estuary, where passing ships would see it as a warning. Consider the message being sent. Not just "we hanged this man," but "we hanged this man, left him for the tide 3 times, coated him in tar, and put him in a cage along the shipping lane so that every sailor entering London would understand what awaits those who prey on ships." And before all of this began, before the procession, before the dock, before the shortened rope, the condemned pirate was allowed to stop at the Turk's Head Inn on Wapping High Street for one last quart of ale, nearly 2 pints, in the hour before death. I've spent some time thinking about this particular detail because it seems so incongruous with everything else about the occasion. The silver oar, the Admiralty ceremony, the deliberately cruel hanging the tide-washed corpse, and in the middle of all that machinery of official terror, a pint at the pub. The explanation that historians favour is practical. It made the condemned more cooperative, more likely to confess to the chaplain, accompanying them, less likely to be disruptive in their final hour. But I think it also reveals something about the Tudor capacity to hold contradictions simultaneously, severity and a kind of rough mercy, power and a brief strange human gesture toward the person about to die. Here is the question I have been building toward. Did any of it work? Did the public hangings at Tyburn, the tarred bodies, at Wapping the brandings and the pillorying and the whipping through the streets, did any of it actually reduce crime in Tudor London? The honest answer, based on the historical evidence, is probably not very much. The pickpockets at the gallows are almost literally the punchline of the whole system. The city whose authorities executed people by the hundreds for theft had more theft than it could manage. Not because Londoners were uniquely dishonest, but because a city of 120,000 people, a third of them in poverty, many of them hungry, will produce crime in proportion to its desperation, regardless of what penalty is attached to getting caught. The Tudor state understood punishment as a performance, as theatre, as a language spoken to the crowd that communicated the terms of power. What it largely did not understand or understood only in its most progressive moments was that the conditions producing crime could be addressed directly rather than punished after the fact. Some officials saw it. The more thoughtful writers of the period saw it. When William Harrison described Tudor England in the 1570s, he noted with some bitterness that the penalties for vagabondage seemed to produce more vagabonds rather than fewer, which suggests he had arrived at a conclusion that the system resisted acknowledging. The crowd at Tyburn cheering for the condemned thief as the cart pulled away had perhaps arrived there too by a different route. There is one last part of Tudor London's geography of justice that I want to mention before we move on, not because it is the most dramatic, but because it sits at the intersection of everything we have been discussing. In 1558, the cells of the Tower of London held people whose crime was nothing more than existing at the wrong moment in English history. Families whose loyalty to the wrong religion, the wrong claimant, the wrong political faction had made them dangerous to the current regime. The Tower was not primarily a place of punishment. It was a place of waiting for trial, for pardon, for the decision that would send you either home or to the scaffold. Elizabeth I herself had waited there not many years before 1558. A princess suspected of treason locked in the Tower by her half-sister Mary, surviving by keeping very still and saying very little. She had walked out of the Tower alive. Many did not. And now, on November the 17th, 1558, that same woman, the one who had sat in a Tower cell and waited, was Queen, the most powerful person in England. What does it do to a person to spend time in a place like that, to watch from a window as others are led to the scaffold, to wait without certainty for your own name to be called, or not called? We cannot know exactly what it did to Elizabeth, but watching how she governed, particularly her reluctance to execute her enemies swiftly, her notorious hesitation before signing death warrants, her habit of keeping people in uncertainty for months or years, rather than reaching immediate conclusions, I suspect she understood in her body, if not always in her policy, something about what it meant to be on the wrong side of the machinery of justice. That knowledge would shape the reign that was just beginning, and the city she was now inheriting, this loud, crowded, complicated, occasionally criminal, frequently punishing, endlessly alive place, was about to meet its new queen for the first time. That meeting and what it revealed about London's character is something we've been approaching since the very beginning of tonight's journey. But before we arrive there, we need to spend some time in the part of this city that existed precisely to absorb everything the official world wanted to have without officially acknowledging. Suffolk after dark is ready for us now. Cross the bridge. That is all it took. 30 seconds of walking the river sliding beneath your feet, the noise of the city receding behind you, and suddenly you were somewhere else entirely. Not just geographically, morally, legally. In 1558, the south bank of the Thames occupied a different relationship with the rules that governed the rest of London, and every person who crossed it understood this the way you understand a change in atmosphere before you can name it. The Lord Mayor of London had authority over the city, his aldermen, his constables, his guild, regulations, his market hours, his carefully maintained fiction of a well-ordered urban community, all of it applied within the walls and the immediate environs of the North Bank. Southwark, sitting just across the Thames, fell under the jurisdiction of liberties that had historically answered to different authorities, chief among them the bishopric of Winchester. When those ecclesiastical structures shifted during the Reformation, the jurisdictional picture became even more complicated. What remained consistent across the changes was this: Southwark was where London put the things it needed but could not officially have. The Tudors had a gift for this arrangement. The city wanted the revenue from certain activities without the embarrassment of acknowledging them. Southwark provided the physical space and the legal ambiguity to make that possible. Let me describe what you would have encountered crossing into Southwark on an afternoon in 1558. The sound reached you first: bear baiting. The Paris Garden, the most famous of Southwark's entertainment arenas in this period, was located in the Liberty of the Clink on Bankside, and on any given afternoon when a baiting was scheduled you could hear it from the bridge. A particular kind of raw crowd part animal, something that sits in the chest differently from other kinds of noise. The arena itself was a circular structure several stories high, open to the sky at the centre. In the pit below, the spectators who sat on raised scaffolding around the perimeter, having paid their penny or twopence for the privilege, a bear would be chained to a post by the leg or neck. Its teeth had been filed down. It could not bite effectively, which was the point. The fight was meant to last long enough to be satisfying entertainment. Then the dogs were released. Old English bulldogs bred specifically for this purpose, trained and encouraged toward a particular kind of courage that manifested as the refusal to release what they had seized hold of. Several dogs at once replaced as they tired or were injured the bear, wheeling and batting and struggling against the chain and the teeth. The noise of it, the crowd, the bear's growls, the dogs, the shouting of men who had placed wagers on the outcome created what one visitor in the following century described as a wild but natural harmony that he found simultaneously compelling and appalling. By 1558, the bear-baiting arena in Southwark was not a recent innovation. It had been operating in some form since at least the early 1500s, when the poet Robert Crowley observed around 1550 that every Sunday they will spend 1 penny or 2 the bearwards living to mend, noting that on any given Sunday at Paris Garden a man shall not fail to find 200 or 300 for the bearwards veil. 200 to 300 people on a Sunday paying for the bear. That number would grow substantially in the years after 1558. By the 1570s, Elizabeth I would appoint a royal official, Ralph Bowes, as Master of Her Majesty's Game at Paris Garden, which tells you that the Queen herself, who had complicated feelings about many of Southwark's entertainments, had entirely uncomplicated feelings about this one. She loved it. She attended. The bear-baiting ring was in the period's social vocabulary not a disreputable place in the sense of being beneath the dignity of the powerful. It was a place where all classes of London assembled together, which was itself a kind of social fact about what Tudor London considered entertainment versus what it considered sin. And here is the distinction that the Tudor official mind made an important one between bear-baiting and what lay in the establishments nearby. Bear-baiting was violent. Bear-baiting was loud and sometimes fatal for the animals, and occasionally for the spectators too. In January of 1583, the scaffolding of one of the Southwark arenas collapsed under the weight of the crowd, killing 8 people and injuring many others. Puritan commentators attributed this to divine displeasure with Sunday entertainments. The arena was repaired and reopened within months, but bear-baiting was not secret. It did not have to be. What happened in the stews of Bankside was different. The word stews require some unpacking before we go further. It originated in 2 directions simultaneously, which is typical of language in a period when etymology and euphemism were both working hard. One derivation traces it to the stew ponds, the fish-breeding pools maintained by the Bishop of Winchester on his Southwark properties, which gives you a sense of how venerable and how deeply embedded in the landscape the bishop's presence there was. The other derivation points to the French word for a heated room, since the establishments had originally been bathhouses, places where people paid to use hot water, which in a city where bathing at home was difficult and expensive had genuine practical value. By the Tudor period, whatever their origins, the stews of Bankside had long since evolved into something rather more specific than bathhouses. They were brothels, between a handful and 18 of them, operating at any given time depending on the year and the current policy of whatever monarch was trying to balance the revenue they generated against the embarrassment of acknowledging them. And here is the detail that I have always found the most extraordinary about the Southwark stews, the detail that has stayed with me since I first encountered it in the historical records, and that I think captures something essential about how Tudor London organised its own hypocrisies. The women who worked in the stews were called Winchester geese, the name derived from the bishop's association with the district. The Bishop of Winchester licensed and taxed the brothels. The church collected rent from them. The bishop's household, one of the wealthiest and most powerful in England, derived income from their operation, and the women who worked there were named in popular usage after the bishop whose institution regulated and profited from their labour. Winchester geese, said with a certain amount of wit, which is how people tend to handle things that are uncomfortable to say plainly. The name had a secondary meaning too. To be bitten by a Winchester goose was the period's way of describing the acquisition of a sexually transmitted disease. The vocabulary of the time was in its way fairly direct about consequences, even when it was indirect about causes. Now, and this is the part that I find genuinely complicated, and where I want to spend a moment being honest about what the historical record shows the women of the stews existed in a state of extraordinary legal and social contradiction. They were taxed by the church that simultaneously declared them sinners. They were tolerated by a city that used their presence and their labour without acknowledging that labour as legitimate. And when they died, and many died young from disease, from violence, from the accumulated hardships of their circumstances, they were buried not in the parish churchyard, not in consecrated ground with the ordinary rites of the church that had collected rent from their earnings. They were buried in a plot of unconsecrated earth called the Single Women's Churchyard, also known as Cross Bones. The historian John Stowe, writing at the end of the 16th century, recorded the tradition precisely. These single women were forbidden the rites of the church so long as they continued that sinful life, and were excluded from Christian burial if they were not reconciled before their death. And therefore there was a plot of ground called the Single Woman's Churchyard appointed for them. The institution profited from them. The institution could not bury them. I'm not sure what I want to say about that exactly, other than that it seems to me to compress an enormous amount of human history into a very small space. The gap between official morality and actual practice, between the stated values of an institution and the way it actually behaved, this gap is not a uniquely Tudor phenomenon. But the Southwark stews make it unusually visible because the paper trail is so clear. The bishop's accounts record the income. The burial records reflect the exclusion. Both exist in the same archive. The brothels in 1558 were not simply establishments that existed in isolation from the rest of Southwark's entertainments. They were embedded in a neighbourhood that included gaming houses, bowling alleys, alehouses, taverns, and the bear-baiting arenas we have already discussed. The Southwark Fair, established by Edward VI in 1550, ran for 3 days each September and brought additional crowds and additional commerce and additional opportunity for all of the above. The alehouses deserve particular mention because they were the connective tissue of the whole enterprise. By 1558, the City of London already had well over 1,000 alehouses within its own boundaries, One historian suggests the number was close to 1,200. Suffolk added its own considerable supply. These were not taverns in the more upscale sense. They range from proper inns serving travellers to single rooms in private houses, where the occupant had obtained a license to sell ale, creating the most minimal possible commercial hospitality. The borderline between an alehouse and a brothel in Suffolk in 1558 was sometimes in practice negotiated on a case-by-case basis. When Henry VIII formally closed the stews in 1546, his periodic attempts to regulate Suffolk always ran into the same problem, which was that closing the officially licensed establishments simply scattered the trade into less visible and less regulated spaces. The poet Robert Crowley observed almost immediately that the former stews had reappeared as ale-houses and taverns. The trade had moved, the trade had not stopped. This pattern official prohibition followed by practical dispersal, followed by gradual re-emergence in slightly different form, repeated itself throughout the Tudor period, with a monotony that would be comic if the human circumstances were not so serious. There is one more element of Suffolk's character in 1558 that I want to mention, because it points towards something that would become enormously important in the decades after our story. The liberty of the Clink, that stretch of Bankside subject to the Bishop of Winchester's jurisdiction, rather than the Lord Mayor's, was by 1558 already beginning to attract something beyond just the pleasures the official city wanted to keep at arm's length. It was attracting artists. The theatrical world of Tudor London was still in 1558 young and disorganised. There were players, companies of men and boys who performed for wages travelling from town to town, or performing in the yards of inns. They performed in the city itself, in courtyards and halls, and whatever spaces would accommodate them. But the city's authorities were deeply suspicious of theatrical performances. They attracted crowds, which meant potential disorder. They involved men wearing costumes and speaking words that might, depending on the content, constitute sedition or immorality. Suffolk's jurisdictional independence made it attractive for the same reason it was attractive to the brothel keepers and the bear-baiters. The rules that applied elsewhere applied differently here, or applied more slowly, or applied only when someone in authority bothered to notice. The first purpose-built theatre on Bankside the Rose would not appear until 1587, nearly 30 years after our story. The Globe would come in 1599, but the conditions that made their eventual appearance possible, the jurisdictional flexibility, the established culture of entertainment, the crowd already accustomed to crossing the river for pleasure, these were already present and functioning in 1558. Southwark in 1558 was in this sense the ground being prepared for something that would eventually transform not just London's culture, but the English language itself. The bear-baiters and the Winchester geese and the alehouse keepers were inadvertently creating the neighbourhood in which Shakespeare would eventually work. I find that to be one of the more beautiful accidents in English cultural history. The question I always return to when I spend time with Southwark's history is something like, what did ordinary people think of it? Not the moralists who thought it was hell on earth and said so at considerable length. Not the city officials who thought it was a necessary evil to be managed at distance. But the apprentice who crossed the bridge on a Sunday afternoon with a penny in his pocket, or the merchant's wife who walked through it quickly on her way somewhere else, or the woman from outside London who had arrived with no resources and found that the stews offered something closer to survival than anything else the city had presented her with. The records that survive are almost entirely institutional laws, sermons, court documents, financial accounts. The interior lives of ordinary Tudor Londoners, their genuine feelings about the place they lived, and the compromises they made and witnessed are largely inaccessible to us. But there is one thing I notice consistently across the period in the records that do survive. People kept crossing the bridge. Whatever they thought about it, however they navigated their relationship with what was there, they crossed. On Sunday afternoons and fair days and ordinary evenings they crossed, in numbers that made Southwark one of the most visited and most economically active parts of London's whole metropolitan area. They crossed because the city had created there a space for things that people want and need, and are not always comfortable naming plainly. That is not a uniquely Tudor arrangement. It describes most cities in most periods if you look carefully. The shadow city is almost always right across the river from the official one, and both of them, the City of London in its guild halls and its churches and its careful ordinances, and Southwark in its bare gardens and its stews and its crowded Sunday alehouses, both of them were in 1558 waiting for the same thing, a new queen, a new beginning. The moment that had been gathering since the very first dawn of our story is almost upon us, and the story of how London received Elizabeth I on the 17th of November, 1558, how a city of that complexity and contradiction responded to the news that it had a new sovereign, is one of the most vivid, most human chapters in the whole of this journey. Get comfortable. We are nearly there. Between 5 and 6 in the morning on the 17th of November, 1558, Queen Mary I drew her last breath. She was 42 years old. She had reigned for 5 years and 4 months, England's first queen regnant, the woman who had navigated the extraordinary difficulty of ruling a kingdom that did not quite believe a woman could rule a kingdom, who had tried with absolute sincerity and terrible cost to return England to the Catholic faith, who had buried 2 phantom pregnancies and watched her husband Philip of Spain grow increasingly distant, and who had burned 274 people for heresy. She died at St. James's Palace in London in her own bedchamber, while the November darkness still held the city. And in that particular darkness, in the hour or two before London woke, history was already moving. The question of what happened next in the hours immediately following Mary's death is one of those corners of historical record where the documentary evidence and the beloved tradition pull in slightly different directions. I want to be honest about that because the most famous image of this moment, the one that has lodged in the popular imagination, sits right in that contested territory. According to tradition, Elizabeth was at Hatfield House when the news arrived. Hatfield was approximately 20 miles north of London, and Elizabeth had been living there as she had for much of her life in the Parkland house that had served as a kind of gilded cage for princes and princesses whom the current monarch needed to watch without appearing to watch. On the morning of November the 17th, according to the story that has been told and retold across 4.5 centuries, Elizabeth was sitting under an oak tree in the park, reading a book, or eating an apple, depending on which version you prefer. The sources diverge pleasantly on this small detail which I find appropriate, given that the whole image has the quality of something too perfectly composed to be entirely spontaneous. She was disturbed by the sound of horsemen. Sir Nicholas Throckmorton had ridden through the night from London to Hatfield, carrying with him a ring, Mary's own ring, as proof that the Queen was dead. Members of Mary's council had also made their way to Hatfield. And when they arrived and found Elizabeth and gave her the news and offered her Mary's ring, she sank to her knees on the grass beneath that oak tree and spoke in Latin. "This is the Lord's doing, it is marvellous in our eyes." From Psalm 118. Now, I want to pause here because this moment deserves more than the romantic image it has become in popular memory. Elizabeth was 25 years old. She had spent most of the previous 5 years in a state of carefully maintained uncertainty, knowing that her sister's government considered her a threat, having briefly been imprisoned in the Tower, the same Tower she would later use to hold her own enemies, knowing that one false step, one incautious word, one association with the wrong faction could end her life. She had learned to be very still, very careful, very precise about what she said and when she said it. When those horsemen arrived, she did not erupt. She did not shout for joy. She sank to her knees on November grass and quoted scripture in Latin. That is a performed response, a shaped response, a response that said, I am a queen, I am a Protestant, I am someone who understands that this moment will be remembered and I will give it the weight it deserves. And this is what I want to say, and what I think often gets lost in the romanticizing, that does not mean it was not also genuine. The greatest human performances often are, while Elizabeth was kneeling on the grass at Hatfield, London, was already changing. At around 11 o'clock in the morning, barely 4 hours after Mary died, heralds in their formal coats stood at the Standard in Cheapside. The Lord Mayor of London, Thomas Lee, was there in scarlet robes. The Duke of Norfolk was present, aldermen, lords. The whole apparatus of civic authority gathered in the heart of the city's great commercial street to make the transfer of power official and visible. The Brewers' Company recorded the scene in their minutes, and the language is so vivid and so immediate that I want to give it to you as close to intact as possible. They wrote that Elizabeth was proclaimed Queen at the Standard in Cheapside, with heralds of arms and trumpeters, and that, at which time were many caps as well of velvet as other with many gloves thrown away for joy and gladness of her highness. Many caps thrown away for joy, many gloves thrown into the air. This is the sound of London in November 1558. Not just bells, though. The bells came all of them, every church in the city ringing through the afternoon. Not just the official proclamation, but people throwing their hats and gloves into the air in the streets because something had ended and something new was beginning, and they did not know yet what exactly that meant. But they knew. They knew they wanted it to be different from what the last 5 years had been. The diarist Henry Machine, a cloth merchant who recorded the daily events of London with the careful attention of someone who understood that ordinary moments accumulate into history, wrote that at afternoon all the churches in London did ring, and at night did make bonfires and set tables in the streets, and did eat and drink. Tables set in the streets. People eating and drinking together in November in the dark by firelight. Not because anyone had organised it, not because anyone had told them to. Because this city, this overcrowded, complicated, smelly, brilliant, broken, resilient city of 120,000 people had waited 5 years for this particular darkness to lift. And when the bells started, when the bonfires started, when the word moved through the lanes and alleys and markets and alehouses that the Queen was dead, and the new Queen was the Protestant daughter of Anne Boleyn, they needed to be together. That need to gather, to eat, to make light in the dark, to mark something that matters with the presence of other human bodies is so ancient and so persistent that I would argue it is one of the most reliable things we know about what it means to be human. Tudor Londoners were not so different from us after all. There is a thread in this story that runs alongside the celebrations and that I want to follow carefully, because it reveals something important about what kind of Queen London was actually welcoming. William Cecil was already at Hatfield on the 17th of November. Not because he had rushed there at the news, because he had been there quietly in the weeks before, in regular communication with Elizabeth, already planning. Cecil had drafted documents in anticipation of the accession. He had thought through the first appointments, the first proclamations, the shape of the first Privy Council. He had, in the careful, methodical way that would define 40 years of service, made sure that when the moment came everything was ready. Elizabeth appointed him her principal Secretary of State on the very first day of her reign. The appointment came before the official council had even fully assembled, and when she swore him in she said something that I find reveals her whole governing philosophy in a single sentence. She said, "This judgment I have of you, that you will not be corrupted with any manner of gifts, and that you will be faithful to the state." Not to her, to the state. A 25-year-old queen on the first day of her reign, in a country that had just spent 5 years watching institutional loyalties bend and break under religious pressure, telling her first minister that her measure of him was his incorruptibility and his faithfulness not to her person but to something larger. That is not a naive statement. It is a politically sophisticated one. It is the statement of someone who understood, perhaps from her years of careful watching, that loyalty to a person is fragile. Loyalty to an institution is more durable, and she was building something that needed to last. On the same day that Elizabeth became queen, the exact same day Cardinal Reginald Pole died at Lambeth Palace in London. Pole was Mary's Archbishop of Canterbury, her closest ecclesiastical advisor, the man who had worked alongside her to restore the Catholic faith in England, who had himself been exiled for decades under Henry VIII, who'd returned to his homeland to participate in what he believed was England's genuine reconciliation with Rome. He'd been ill since September. When news of Mary's death reached him that morning, he received it in silence. According to the accounts of those who were present, he sat still for perhaps a quarter of an hour not speaking. Then his body, already weakened by illness, seemed to receive the news as a final blow. He died that evening. Both the old world and the new world ended on the same day, closed on the same day, mourned on the same day. The last Catholic Archbishop of Canterbury and the Catholic Queen he had served both gone before the sun set on November the 17th. I have spent a long time thinking about what this particular coincidence means, or whether it means anything at all. History is full of coincidences that feel significant and turn out to be nothing but timing. But the symbolic weight of it, one reign ending, and a new one beginning with all its religious implications on a single day. The Archbishop who had embodied the old dispensation dying within hours of the Queen, whose dispensation it was that weight has accumulated across the centuries for good reason. It felt to the people who witnessed it like a door closing and a window opening, simultaneously, in the same hour. Let me tell you about London in the weeks that followed, because the city's response to Elizabeth in those early days tells you something essential about the relationship that would define the next 45 years. She moved from Hatfield toward London with a procession that grew as it travelled. Lords and ladies, knights and their attendants, the whole mobile apparatus of a nascent court, forming itself around its new centre as she moved south. By the time she reached the outer edges of the city, the procession had swelled to something extraordinary. One account describes more than 1,000 lords, knights, gentlemen, ladies and gentlewomen accompanying her. On the 14th of January 1559, about 2 months after our story's central day, Elizabeth would process through the streets of London to her coronation. The city prepared pageants at various points along the route, elaborate theatrical displays with speeches and symbolism, the whole apparatus of civic welcome deployed to its fullest extent. At one point during the coronation procession, an old man in the crowd was weeping. Someone near Elizabeth told her what he was doing. She reportedly looked toward the man and said simply, "I warrant you it is for gladness. I warrant you it is for gladness." A queen reading her city's emotion accurately in a single glance. That capacity to see people, to understand what they needed, to reflect it back to them in language that was neither condescending nor falsely modest, would become the defining quality of her long reign. The City of London had in its way been watching her develop it through 25 years of careful, constrained, often frightening preparation. And now she was here, ready. There is a question I want to ask you now as we approach the final hours of tonight's journey through this extraordinary city. You have spent this time with London in 1558, with its water and its bread, its plague and its bear gardens, its bridge of heads and its Cheapside gold, its Winchester geese and its ringing bells, its 40,000 men who earned their living from the river, its third who lived in poverty, its children who were adults at 9, and grandparents at 40. What stays with you, not the dates, not the statistics, I mean the people, the fishwives of Billingsgate with their formidable vocabularies, the waterman crying, "Oars across the Thames at first light," the woman who bribed the keeper of the heads to give her father's remains back, Margaret Roper carrying home what she could not leave on the bridge, the condemned man at the pub at St. Giles cracking jokes to the regulars, the wise woman in her narrow house with her knowledge of plants, treating the people the physicians would not, the apprentice boy on a Sunday afternoon crossing the bridge with a penny in his pocket, the diarist Henry Mackin writing down what he saw because someone should, all of them on the 17th of November throwing their hats in the air, or standing in the street at a table set out in the dark, eating and drinking with their neighbours in November firelight. All of them for one day on the same side of something. A new queen, a new chance, the same hope dressed in different clothes that cities have always carried when one chapter closes and another opens. There is still more to see before our night is done. The children of Tudor London, small figures in this large story, are waiting for us, and their world is both the most heartbreaking and the most surprising chapter we have left to explore. What it meant to grow up in this city, to be young, in a world that aged you fast, to be a child, in a place that simultaneously depended on your labour and loved you with a tenderness that the historical record unexpectedly and movingly preserved for us. That story is next. Somewhere in the mud of the Thames foreshore right now there are toys. Not many, the organic ones rotted long ago, the wood and the cloth and the leather swallowed by centuries of river water. But the ones made from metal survived, and when archaeologists began serious excavation of the Thames bank in the later decades of the 20th century, they found them small pewter knights on horseback barely larger than a thumb. Little cups and plates and jugs obviously made for small hands, figurines cast from moulds in quantities that suggest, and this is the part that genuinely moves me, mass production. Someone in Tudor London was manufacturing toys at scale, making them in large enough numbers that the price came down to where a craftsman's family, a merchant's household, maybe even a labourer with a good week behind him could afford one for a child. Those toys ended up in the river the way most things ended up in the river in 1558, lost, dropped, swept away, fallen from a bridge or a wharf or a small pair of hands. They sat in the mud for 400 years and waited to be found. And when historians found them, they changed the story. Because there is a theory, or there was for a long time, that Tudor parents did not really love their children. Not the way we understand love. Not with the emotional investment that we bring to the relationship between parent and child. The theory was proposed in 1960 by a French historian named Philippe Ariès, and it has since been so thoroughly taken apart by the historical evidence that it barely survives as a serious scholarly position. But it lodged itself deeply enough in popular imagination that it is still sometimes repeated as fact that because so many Tudor children died, parents held themselves at a certain emotional distance, could not afford to invest too much in a creature so likely to leave them early. The problem with this theory, as the historian Nicholas Orme demonstrated in his comprehensive study of Tudor childhood, is that the evidence almost universally contradicts it. The toys are one piece of evidence, but there are others, and they accumulate into something that feels to me genuinely important. Latin exercise books used in Tudor grammar schools, the text that boys practice translating between Latin and English contain sentences like, "Since my brother died a year ago, my mother has been weeping constantly," and "I will buy a rattle to still my baby from crying." These are not philosophical sentences. They are not historical examples. They are the everyday emotional texture of Tudor family life, pressed into a language learning exercise because someone needed sentences that would feel real and immediate to the students translating them. A grieving mother, a crying baby, a father who is going to buy a rattle, The Museum of London holds a child's woolen mitten, a small knitted thing carefully made lost somewhere in the city and found much later in an excavation. Someone knitted that. Someone sat with needles and yarn and made something warm for small hands, because winter in Tudor London was cold, and a child's hands needed to be kept from it. Family gravestones across the period show children carved in stone, their faces preserved in marble, by parents who could not bear to let them be forgotten. Archaeological evidence suggests that children born with severe disabilities, conditions that required intensive sustained care, grew into adulthood in Tudor families, which means those families chose to provide that care across years and decades without any of the institutional support that we have developed since. None of this proves that Tudor parenting looked like modern parenting. The practices were sometimes profoundly different. But the emotional investment, the fundamental human refusal to be indifferent to a child in your care, the evidence says it was there, in the mitten, in the toys, in the weeping mother in the Latin exercise, in the carved faces in the stone. Now let me tell you what Tudor London's children actually lived, because the love that surrounded them where it existed coexisted with circumstances that would be unrecognisable and unacceptable by modern standards. Every child in London in 1558 began life the same way, regardless of their family's wealth, tightly swaddled. Wrapped from neck to toe in linen strips, arms bound against the body legs immobilised, only the head left free. They remained this way for weeks, sometimes months, up to 4 months in some medical advice of the period. The reasoning was that unswaddled limbs might develop crooked, that a baby needed to be physically constrained while its body formed itself into the correct human shape. To modern eyes, this looks cruel. To Tudor parents, it looked like protection, and to some degree the court records support a grim logic. The unswaddled infant left mobile in a Tudor home, with its open fires, unguarded stairs, and busy adult world moving around it, was genuinely at greater risk of accident. The swaddled infant immobile in its cradle was at least contained. The world into which Tudor children were born was simply more dangerous than ours, and the responses to that danger did not always look like care even when they were. At around 7 years old, something fundamental shifted. 7 was a threshold in Tudor England that carried the weight of both theology and common sense. Before 7, a boy was dressed much as girls were dressed, remained in his mother's household, was understood to be in a period of formation rather than function. After 7, his clothing changed. His company changed, his responsibilities began to accumulate. For the children of the poor, and we've established already that roughly a third of London's population lived in genuine poverty, 7 was often the age at which work became a daily reality. About 2,000 children were employed as pin makers in Tudor London, 2,000 children making pins. Pin making was one of those trades that required what the masters who employed these children called small, quick fingers. Children could work the delicate wire, could perform the intricate small movements of the craft more efficiently than adults. They were also significantly cheaper to employ. They worked long hours. They were not by the standards of the time considered to be suffering any unusual hardship. This was simply what childhood meant for children in that economic situation. I hold this fact at some distance because the temptation is to simply condemn it, and condemnation is easy. But the Tudor parent who sent their 9-year-old to a pinmaker's workshop was not in most cases acting from indifference or cruelty. They were acting from the mathematics of survival in a city where there was no safety net, where winter was real and rent was due, and a child who could contribute something was a child whose family ate a little better. The system was terrible. The people inside it were mostly just people. For children who had no family at all, London's orphans, its abandoned infants, its children of parents taken by plague or sweating sickness, or the accumulated weight of poverty the city had by 1558 developed something remarkable. Christ's Hospital was founded in 1552, 6 years before our story, by the young King Edward VI, on the grounds of the former Greyfriars Monastery in Newgate Street. By the time Elizabeth came to the throne, it was caring for up to 396 children at a time, feeding them clothing, them giving them medicine when they were sick, and bringing them, according to the records, toys and games. An orphanage in the middle of the 16th century that explicitly recorded bringing toys to children. The records of Christ's Hospital are among the more quietly extraordinary documents of the Tudor period, because they demonstrate something that the Arius theory could not accommodate: a public institution funded by civic money, operating on the principle that orphaned children deserved not just survival, but something approaching care, that they had the right to play, that being poor and parentless did not disqualify you from the ordinary pleasures of childhood. It was imperfect, as all institutions are imperfect. The children of Christ's Hospital were also being trained for trades and occupations, being prepared for the working lives they would assume when they left. This was not modern childhood, but it was something. The question of education in Tudor London in 1558 is, like so many things about this period, a story of extraordinary contrast between those who had access to it and those who did not. At the top of the educational world sat the sons of the nobility and upper gentry, educated by private tutors who might include some of the finest humanist scholars in England. Henry VIII himself had been taught by poets and theologians. The daughters of Thomas More received an education that astonished and impressed their contemporaries. By 1558, the Queen, who had just inherited England, was a woman who read Latin, Greek, French and Italian, who'd been educated partly by the Cambridge scholar Roger Ascham, who would go on to famously describe her intellectual abilities with something close to awe. Below them, the grammar schools, some newly founded after the dissolution of the monasteries, had wiped out the educational institutions they had supported, some ancient and enduring. The Merchant Taylors' School has been established in 1561, just 3 years after our story. Westminster School was refounded by Elizabeth herself in 1560, with 40 free places for boys known as the Queen's Scholars. In 1558, across London and its surroundings, a patchwork of educational opportunity was being stitched together after the disruptions of the previous decades. At grammar school, if a boy was lucky enough to attend one, the curriculum was demanding in a way that would stun a modern 12-year-old. Latin was the foundation of everything: grammar, rhetoric, logic. The exercises in William Horman's Latin textbook, the Vulgurier, were built around sentences that described chess dice, and tennis, deliberately making the lessons feel connected to real life, the same way a good teacher today reaches for the familiar. For girls, even in families where education was valued, the path was different. A wealthy girl might receive excellent instruction at home in languages and music and the management of a household. A poor girl was unlikely to receive any formal education at all. The gap between Elizabeth, who could conduct state correspondence in 4 languages, and the daughter of a Suffolk dock worker, who would never learn to write her own name, was one of the greatest in the city. Here is what I keep coming back to when I think about Tudor London's children. They played the same games. Not literally, the rich child's toys were finer. The poor child's games were rougher. The opportunities were radically different. But the impulse behind the play was identical. Boys rolled hoops made from old barrel staves down narrow lanes. They threw pebbles in patterns that amounted to a version of what we call marbles. They inflated pig bladders and kicked them around open spaces, the football of 1558, formless and exuberant and completely recognizable 4.5 centuries later. Girls played with dolls made from wood or bundled cloth. They set up imaginary households, presided over miniature domestic worlds, practiced at the only role the official world was preparing them for, but did so with the genuine pleasure of children anywhere who are allowed to arrange the world according to their own imagination. The boys in the Coventry Grammar School sometime in the 1550s were dropping things through the gaps in the floorboards of their classroom. When archaeologists excavated the site in the 1960s, they found what those boys had stashed animal bones from their lunches, cherry stones used as marbles, metal pins used as betting tokens in whatever games they played between lessons. The accumulated evidence of boredom and play and small private pleasure in a setting designed for discipline and study. I love this detail more than almost any other from the whole Tudor period. A 12-year-old boy in 1555 bored in a Latin lesson dropping a cherry stone through a gap in the floorboards. And there it stayed for 400 years waiting. Proof that boredom in school is not a modern invention, and neither is the small ingenious rebellion against it. When I stand back from all of this, from the pin makers and the Christ's Hospital orphans and the cherry stones and the pewter knights, and the weeping mothers in the Latin exercises, what I see is something more complicated and more human than either the Victorian sentimentalisation of the Tudor period or the 20th century dismissal of it. Tudor London's children were not small adults in the way the older theory claimed. They were children capable of grief and play and boredom and love and small rebellion, living in circumstances that were often hard, sometimes brutal, and occasionally illuminated by moments of tenderness so genuine that they survived 4 centuries of archival neglect to reach us. The mitten in the Museum of London. Someone knitted that. Someone's hands made that small warm thing for small cold hands in a city that was trying, as all cities always try, to hold its people together against the darkness of November and poverty and disease and uncertainty. They mostly managed. And the ones who did not, the children buried in crossbones the names in the parish registers that appear and then disappear, the forgotten small lives they were mourned. We know they were mourned. The evidence is in the stone and in the text and in the small cold mitten. There is one more chapter left in tonight's journey, and it is perhaps the most intimate one of all, because we have been moving through this city in its daylight hours, through its markets and its courts and its bear gardens and its schools and its celebrations, but we have not yet sat with it in the dark. We have not yet followed the Londoner of 1558 through the final hours of the day, through the ritual of putting a city to sleep and asking what they thought about before the candles went out. That night, those thoughts, that silence. It is just ahead. The word curfew comes from the French, couvre-feu, cover the fire, not as most people assume a command to get indoors before some arbitrary deadline, though that was one of its effects. The original imperative was simpler and more practical as night descended on a city built almost entirely from timber and thatch, and dry wood packed in close against its neighbours. Every householder was expected to cover their fire with a ceramic dome called a curfew, a lid with ventilated sides that contained the embers just enough to keep them alive, without letting them escape into the room, and from there into the street, and from there into everything else. In 1558, the Great Fire of London was still more than a century away. But the fear that produced that later catastrophe, the knowledge that one careless ember could eat through a Tudor street with a speed that no bucket brigade could match, was already built into the fabric of daily life. Every evening ritual in Tudor London was at its core about managing the danger of fire in the dark. St. Giles, without Cripplegate, St. Bride's, St. Mary le Bow, and the Church of Barking. These were the 4 churches designated to ring the curfew bell each evening in London, their sounds cascading across the city at intervals timed, so that each parish could hear at least one of them and know that the evening ritual had begun. By 8 o'clock the bells were ringing. By 9 or 10 the night watch, a rotating corps of citizens pressed into service to patrol the streets, had taken up their positions. After that, the city was a different place. Let me tell you what London actually looked like after dark, because this is where the distance between 1558 and now becomes most visceral, most immediate, most impossible to fully reconstruct in the imagination. There was no street lighting, none at all. The gas lamps that would eventually line London's main thoroughfares were 2.5 centuries in the future. The electric lighting that would eventually banish nighttime darkness entirely was 3 centuries away. In 1558, when the sun went down over London, the city entered a darkness that modern eyes have genuinely lost the ability to process. Not complete darkness. On clear nights, the moon and stars provided some light, and on a full moon over the Thames the reflections could be remarkable. But on cloudy November nights in the narrow lanes and alleys between the jettied houses, whose upper floors blocked even what sky there was, darkness could become something physical, something you moved through carefully, hands sometimes outstretched, listening. The wealthy navigated this with link boys, young men and boys who carried torches, links they were called, a cotton wick soaked in pitch or tallow, and hired themselves out to escort the well-off through the streets after dark. If you had money and needed to travel at night, in 1558 you hailed a link boy the way you would hail a cab today. He walked ahead, torch-raised light pooling on the wet cobblestones. When you arrived home there was likely a metal cone attached to the exterior wall, a link extinguisher where he doused his flame and collected his fee. For those who did not have money for a link boy, the night demanded either staying home or navigating by memory, by the dim light of a rush, light a reed soaked in mutton fat that burned for hours but sputtered and smoked, and produced a flame barely sufficient to see a hand in front of your face. The night watch was in theory there to keep order. In practice, the watch was made up of ordinary citizens rotating through civic duty, not professional law enforcers. Night watchmen patrolled from 9 or 10 in the evening until sunrise, empowered to stop and question anyone moving through the streets after the curfew bell without obvious legitimate purpose. The law that underpinned their authority was effectively a social curfew. If you were out after dark, you needed a reason. Who you were, where you were going, and how you were dressed determined whether the watch let you through or brought you in. Classes in all things in Tudor London governed the darkness. Here is the thing about the Tudor night that I find most fascinating and that most people I think have never encountered. Tudor Londoners almost certainly did not sleep the way you are probably trying to sleep right now. They slept in 2 phases. The historian Roger Kirsch spent decades researching what he called segmented sleep in the pre-industrial world, drawing evidence from more than 500 references in documents, ranging from court depositions to diaries to imaginative literature. What he found and what he laid out in his 2001 essay and his subsequent book at day's close was that across early modern Europe, the standard pattern for nighttime sleep was not a single unbroken block, but 2 distinct periods, first sleep and second sleep. People went to bed not long after dark in November in London. The sun set around 4 in the afternoon, though most would not have retired that early. First sleep began and lasted for several hours. Then typically around midnight they woke, and they stayed awake for an hour or 2. This interval had its own name, the watching. Sometimes the watch. What did Tudor Londoners do during the watch? Everything, apparently. They stoked the fire. They visited the privy. Some prayed. Some reflected on the dreams that had just preceded their waking dreams that were considered particularly vivid and significant at this hour. Some made love. Some visited neighbours in the same state of midnight wakefulness. Scholars wrote. Poets composed. The watch was a recognised, expected normal part of the night, not an interruption of sleep, but an interval built into it. Medical texts of the period discussed the watch without treating it as a disorder to be corrected. Ekirch found the pattern referenced in sources ranging from Chaucer to 16th-century court depositions to the margins of commonplace books. It was simply how night worked. Now, I want to be careful here because Ekirch's work has generated some scholarly debate, and not all historians accept his conclusions in their fullest form. Some argue that his evidence base is more fragmentary than his conclusions require that the references to first sleep in historical documents do not necessarily imply a universal and structured two-phase pattern. The conversation is ongoing, but what is not seriously in dispute is that the experience of night in 1558 was genuinely different from ours in ways that matter. The darkness was more total. The silence, or the near silence, broken by distant church bells and the sounds of the river and the occasional challenge of the night watch, was more complete. And the relationship between waking and sleeping, between the day mind and the night mind, was shaped by conditions that our artificially lit, constantly connected world has rendered invisible to us. When you wake at 3 in the morning and cannot fall back to sleep, and you lie there turning thoughts over in the dark, you are closer to the Tudor Londoner's experience of night than perhaps at any other moment of your modern life. What did Tudor Londoners think about in the dark? This is the question that no historical document can fully answer, and yet it is the one that interests me most. The official answers, the ones the Church provided, the ones that appear in devotional literature and theological guidance, were clear enough. You prayed, you examined your conscience, you prepared your soul. The theological framework of the period held that sleep was a minor version of death, a daily rehearsal for the final surrender of consciousness, and the rituals surrounding it reflected that gravity. The wealthy kept small religious objects by their beds, carved crosses, medallions of saints' objects, believed to offer some protection through the dark hours. The belief that evil spirits were particularly active in the night, that the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beyond it thinned as darkness deepened. This was not superstition in the dismissive modern sense. It was the operating cosmology of the period taken seriously by learned men and common labourers alike. But official answers and actual private thoughts are rarely identical in any period of history. So let me offer something less official. In 1558 London, on the night of November the 17th, the ordinary inhabitants of this city had experienced something extraordinary that day. Bells ringing, bonfires in the streets, tables set out in November, darkness, people eating and drinking together with neighbours they'd quarrelled with last week and would quarrel with again next week, but who tonight were simply the people standing nearest. A new queen, a Protestant queen, which meant for many the end of 5 years in which attending the wrong kind of religious service could get you burned at the stake. Can you imagine what that particular night felt like? Not the triumphant public version, not the bonfires and the caps thrown in the air, but the private version. The moment when you blew out your rushlight or covered your fire and lay down in the dark alone with whatever thoughts the day had produced. Some people in that city would have felt nothing but relief. Pure, overwhelming relief so complete it felt physical, like setting down something very heavy after carrying it too long. Some would have felt something more complicated. Those who had genuinely believed in the old faith, who'd lost something real on this day, not just a queen, but a whole orientation toward God and salvation, and the structure of the universe they lay down in that same darkness with a grief that had no safe public expression. Some would have thought about the dead. Tudor London lost people constantly the way any city of this period did. Parents, children, neighbours, friends, the dead were never very far from the living in 1558, both literally and in the mind. The churchyards were full. The parish registers were crowded with names. November is a month with old bones in it, and no amount of bonfires entirely chases away what that month carries. And some, I suspect, thought about nothing in particular. The way you sometimes think about nothing in particular before sleep when the mind loosens its grip on the day's urgencies and simply drifts. The craftsman on Cheapside, his hands rough from the day's work, falling into the first sleep without ceremony. The waterman's wife in Bankside, children sleeping around her, the sound of the river coming through the walls, the cold settling in. The girl at Christ's Hospital, one of those 396 orphaned children warm in the dormitory for the first time in perhaps a long time, going to sleep without knowing that history was happening in the city outside her window. They were all in the same darkness, all of them on that particular November night belonging to the same city. The night watch changed shift at intervals through the darkness. The bells marked each hour at St. Giles, without Cripplegate at St. Bride's, at St. Mary le Bow at Barking. The Thames ran quietly, or not so quietly depending on the tide. Somewhere along the north bank a link boy was walking home, his torch guttered out his pockets a little heavier than the morning. In Hatfield, about 20 miles north of the city, a 25-year-old woman who'd been sitting under an oak tree that morning was now a queen. She was in the great hall of Hatfield House, in the first council meeting of her reign, surrounded by men who had spent the day racing to attach themselves to the new reality. William Cecil was there already holding documents, already thinking 3 moves ahead. The practical work of governing a kingdom does not wait for morning, but somewhere between the last candle and the first light she too must have slept. What she dreamed we do not know. What she hoped we can only guess. What she inherited, this enormous, complicated, beautiful, terrible, alive in every possible way city we've been walking through together, you and I, for the whole of this long night. And we are nearly at the end of it. Just one more chapter remains. The chapter about what happens when the candle goes out completely, when the city settles into its deepest silence, when the question of what Tudor London has left us, what it means to have lived in this particular place, at this particular moment in history, finally gets its answer, or something close to one. Stay with me. In 1912, workmen demolishing a timber-framed building on Cheapside hit something in the cellar, a wooden box. Inside it more than 400 pieces of jewellery, rings, brooches, chains, scent bottles, cameos, the accumulated working stock of a goldsmith's shop buried sometime around 1640, and then simply never retrieved. The person who hid it, whoever they were, never came back. The box sat in the dark beneath Cheapside, beneath the reconstruction after the Great Fire of 1666, beneath the Georgian buildings that replaced the Tudor ones, beneath the centuries of city that kept piling itself on top of itself. It waited almost 300 years. When they opened it, the emeralds were still green. Rubies from India, turquoise from Persia, sapphires from places that English merchants had travelled to with extraordinary effort and expense. 30 delicate gold chains perfectly preserved. A scent bottle with enamel and chalcedony leaves still beautiful, still suggesting the perfume it once held. Musk oils, ambergris, something sweet from very far away. The Cheapside hoard, as it is now known, sits mostly in the Museum of London, and it is one of the most extraordinary objects in the city's possession. Not because of what it is worth, though it is priceless, but because of what it proves. It proves that the world we have been walking through together tonight was real, not a reconstruction, not a historical imagination. Real people with real hands made those chains, wore those rings, locked them in a box on a street we've walked with them through this entire story, and then disappeared into history while the street kept going without them. We have spent a long night in 1558 London. We have followed the river in the dark and watched the tide change. We have stood at the Standard in Cheapside and heard the proclamation. We have crossed London Bridge in the middle of the afternoon crowd and not looked up at what was mounted above the gate, or perhaps we did look up because that was part of what this city was. We have sat in the alehouses of Southwark and listened to the bear baiting in the distance, and thought about what it meant that both existed on the same street. We have visited the stews and the cookshops and the gallows and the grammar schools and the hospitals, and the cramped tenements of the East End and the careful wood-panelled chambers of Whitehall. We have knelt in imagination beside an oak tree at Hatfield, and heard in Latin what it feels like to become a queen. And now, with the city's candles guttered and the night watch changing shift and the first grey edge of dawn beginning somewhere to the east, now it is time to ask what it all means, which is of course the most impossible question, and also the most necessary one. Let me tell you what I believe, having spent a great deal of time with this city and this year and these people. I believe that 1558 London is not as far away from us as it looks. The distance is real. The suffering was real. The poverty, the disease, the brutality of the justice system, the narrowness of the lives available to most of the people who live there, all of that was real and should not be romanticized. We are genuinely fortunate to live when we do. Genuinely. But the waterman on the Thames calling out for passengers at dawn working a trade his father had worked, and that his son would work, he was motivated by the same combination of obligation and habit and love and anxiety that motivates us. The woman knitting a small mitten in winter to keep her child's hands warm was doing exactly what you would do given the same circumstances and the same love and the same inadequate resources. The man who cracked a joke on the way to the gallows was doing what people always do when they're frightened and have an audience, making the fear something other than itself. The diarist Henry Machine, writing down the details of ordinary London days in his neat merchant's hand, was doing what journalists and bloggers and podcasters do today, saying that this happened and it matters and someone should remember it. The historian John Stowe, who was alive in 1558 as a young man, and who spent the rest of his long life carefully recording the physical and social fabric of Tudor London, in his Survey of London, published in 1598, described his city at the end of that survey with something that even now reads like a declaration of love. He called it the fairest, largest, richest and best inhabited city in the world. He lived there his whole life, through all of it, through the plagues and the burnings and the bonfires and the political upheavals and the glittering queens and the hard grinding work of being ordinary in an extraordinary place. And he loved it, understood it as something worth recording for people who had not seen it and would not see it. Trusted that the detail of it, the specific, particular, irreplaceable detail of a city in a moment, was worth preserving. I have tried to do something of the same tonight. Here is what 1558 gave the world in the years that followed from that November morning. The accession of Elizabeth I was the beginning of a reign that would last 45 years. During those years, the English language entered one of its greatest periods of creativity. Shakespeare was born in 1564, 6 years after our story. He grew up in an England shaped by the political, religious and cultural decisions made on the day we've been exploring. The theatre world that would produce his plays grew from the jurisdictional peculiarities of Suffolk, where we have walked. The Globe Theatre that would perform his work was built from the dismantled pieces of an earlier playhouse. The language he wrote in was the language being spoken in the cookshops and the alehouses and the markets and the counting houses of 1558. London slightly less polished, slightly more alive, constantly being made and remade by the mouths of 120,000 people who had come from everywhere and needed to talk to each other. The English language in 1558 was still becoming what it is now, and London was the place where that becoming happened. By the time Elizabeth died in 1603, the city had doubled in size from approximately 100,000 people to nearly 200,000. The trading companies that would eventually become the foundations of a global commercial empire were being established. Francis Drake had sailed around the world. Sir Walter Raleigh had attempted colonies in the Americas. The maps were being redrawn, the world being enlarged. The horizons pushed further out than any generation before had pushed them, all of it growing from the seed of that November morning. But I want to be careful, because the Golden Age story, the one where 1558 marks the beginning of England's glorious Elizabethan era, is true only in certain lights. The Hampton Court Palace historians I respect most point out that the Elizabethan era was not simply golden. The last years of Elizabeth's reign saw economic decline, political conflict within her council, and the beginning of the tensions that would eventually tear England apart in the Civil War of the 1640s. The stability of Elizabeth's middle years was real, and it was remarkable compared to what came before and after, but it was not uncomplicated, and the people who suffered most in 1558 London, the one-third in poverty, the Winchester geese, in their unconsecrated graveyard, the children making pins in workrooms, the vagabonds facing the terrible arithmetic of the law, most of them were not substantially better off by 1603. The Elizabethan Golden Age, like all Golden Ages, was golden for some people more than others. That too is part of the story, and it too deserves to be in this room with us tonight. There is a question I want to leave you with as our journey together through this city draws toward its close. Not a historical question, a personal one. Why does this matter to you? Not in the grand societal sense. History always matters. The past always informs the present, and so on. I mean, why are you here at this particular hour listening to this particular story? What is it that draws us in the quiet moments toward the lives of people who died 4.5 centuries ago? What do we find there that we are looking for? I've thought about this a great deal, and I've come to something like an answer, or at least a working hypothesis. I think we go to history because it reminds us that the human experience is larger than our own individual moment, that the anxieties and joys and small victories and large griefs that make up our days are not specific to our time. They have always been part of being alive. The Tudor Londoner who lay awake in the small hours of the watching, turning thoughts over in the dark was doing exactly what many of us are doing right now. They had different fears, different names for their gods, different materials around them. But the basic texture of consciousness at 2 a.m, the half-dreaming, the circling thoughts, the small inventory of what the day brought and what tomorrow requires, that is the same. History at its best is not an escape from the present. It is a way of finding the present in company, of discovering that you're not alone in what it feels like to be human. Tudor London in 1558 was a city of 120,000 people who were not alone. They were pressed together in narrow streets, sharing beds and bread, and the same tidal river, and the same unpredictable mortality. They fought with each other and helped each other and ignored each other, and occasionally on the night of November the 17th they set tables in the street and ate together in the dark because something had ended and something new was beginning, and being human in those moments requires being together. That impulse to be together, to mark what matters with shared presence, is what made them people. And it is what makes us people too. The city is quiet now. The bells of St. Giles without Cripplegate rang an hour ago. The night watch is on its second rotation. The Thames is doing what the Thames always does, breathing in and out with the tide indifferent to history, carrying everything and keeping none of it. Somewhere on Cheapside, beneath a street that will not be paved for another century, there is a wooden box. It will stay there for 300 years. Somewhere at Hatfield House, a 25-year-old woman is asleep with the weight of a kingdom not quite yet settled on her shoulders. It is only the first day after all, and the morning still hours away. Somewhere in the tenements east of the tower, a child is sleeping with 3 siblings in a bed that is too small, and a room that is too cold, and will wake before sunrise to begin a day of work, and will do so without complaint because this is what their life is. and because children are resilient in ways that adults sometimes forget. Somewhere on the river, a wherry is moving upstream in the dark, the waterman rowing by feel and memory reading the current through his hands going home. All of them, the queen, the child, the waterman, the diarist and the fishwife and the pinmaker, and the wise woman and the apprentice boy with his penny for the bear garden, and the condemned man who made a joke at St. Giles, all of them are sleeping now or about to. All of them are letting the day go. And so perhaps can you. Thank you. Truly from wherever I am as I write this to wherever you are as you listen, thank you for spending this long night with me and with them, for staying with the story long enough to feel the weight and texture of a city 4.5 centuries gone, for being curious about lives that left barely a trace and for understanding that those traces matter. History is not the past. History is the conversation we carry forward, the accumulated understanding of where we came from and what it cost and what it gave. Every person we have met tonight was real. Every stone we walked on was real. Every bell we heard was real. And now they are part of your story too. Rest well. The candles are out. The city is sleeping. And the next journey, a different city, a different year, a different set of lives waiting to be found and walk through together is already out there taking shape in the dark. Stay close. There is always more to discover. Good night.